Hello guys, it's nice to have you here tonight, and before we begin I want to say thank you for pressing play, because we're about to drift into a long story that may sound quiet and soothing at first, yet carries with it the heavy weight of the past, a past that belonged to ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary misery. And before we step into that world, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? Which part of the world holds you right now? And what time is it? Where you are, because I always find it fascinating to imagine these words traveling across time zones and across nights, and perhaps you are in a dimly lit room, or lying in bed with your eyes already half closed, or maybe you're on a bus, or in a cafe, and still these words will pull you slowly back into the cold and brutal years of the Eastern Front during the Second World War. The Eastern Front is often described as a place of unimaginable suffering, but most people never sit and truly picture the details of what it meant to be there, what it meant to open your eyes in the morning, if you could even call it morning, because so many times the sky remained gray or filled with snow or smoke, and what it meant to take that first breath in air that was so sharp with frost that it stung your throat, and what it meant to move your body when the layers of wool and cloth were stiff from ice, when your boots were caked with frozen mud, when your hands ached from gripping a rifle that felt less like a weapon and more like an iron bar pressing against raw skin. Imagine that you are there, not as a general reading maps in a warm office, but as an ordinary soldier, one of the millions, with no power, no choices, just the endless duty of survival. You would have woken up on a bed of straw, or perhaps no bed at all, only the ground of a drafty hut or a hole dug into the frozen soil, a dugout lined with logs, where condensation dripped from the roof and rats scurried in the corners, and if you were lucky there might be a small stove with scraps of wood burning weakly, but most mornings the fire would have died overnight, leaving only ash and the sickly smell of smoke clinging to your coat. Breakfast was not what you and I think of as breakfast, not eggs or toast or warm coffee, but a crust of black bread so dense it could be mistaken for a block of wood, a sliver of salt pork if supplies had come through, sometimes nothing more than watery soup with bits of cabbage floating like tired leaves, and men chewed slowly, swallowing hard, because the food was never enough to fill the stomach. It was only enough to remind the body that it still existed. Hunger was constant, gnawing, and in winter it grew even sharper because every step, every breath burned more calories than the meager rations could replace. And yet hunger was not the only enemy. There was the cold, the kind of cold that no blanket, no scarf, no coat could truly keep away. A cold that stiffened your joints, cracked your lips, froze the sweat inside your clothes. A cold that lingered even in your bones, and if you tried to sleep it could creep up quietly and steal your consciousness forever. So men huddled together like animals, pressing body against body, not out of friendship but out of raw survival, because body heat was the last barrier between life and the snow. During the day, when you were ordered to move, you dragged yourself out into a landscape that looked endless, wide plains stretching to horizons without end, forests stripped bare, villages burned to black skeletons, roads churned into mud that in winter hardened like iron and in spring melted into seas of filth, and everywhere lay the evidence of fighting, shattered wagons, broken helmets, scorched earth, and the silence pierced only by artillery far in the distance or the moan of the wind. To march across that terrain was not like walking through the countryside. It was like walking through a graveyard too vast to ever measure. And you were never truly clean, because there was no time, no hot water, no soap, lice crawled under your collar, fleas nested in the seams of your trousers, and men scratched themselves until their skin bled, but the itching never stopped, and in the dark of night you could hear the sound of countless fingernails rasping across skin, a strange chorus of suffering that became as natural as breathing. At times, soldiers tried to entertain themselves, not because there was joy left in them, but because the human mind cannot sit endlessly in silence, so they sang songs from home, sometimes quietly, sometimes drunkenly if they had managed to steal or barter for a bottle of harsh spirits. They told jokes that weren't really funny. They carved chess pieces from scraps of wood. They read letters so many times that the paper fell apart, and if they had no letters, they pretended to write them, talking aloud to the mothers or wives or children they might never see again, creating words in the air that dissolved like smoke but gave a momentary comfort. And always there was the dirt, the mud, the smell of unwashed bodies, the smoke of burning fuel, the groan of wagons pulled by horses whose ribs showed through their skin, the coughs of men sick with typhus or pneumonia, the ever-present thunder of artillery rolling across the plains, sometimes close enough to make the ground shake beneath your boots, sometimes so far away that it sounded like a storm at sea, constant, unending, wearing down the nerves until you no longer reacted, until it became just another part of the background, like the sound of your own heartbeat. All of this was life on the Eastern Front, and for men who lived it, every hour was a trial, every day a test, and most would say that you, sitting comfortably now, would not last even one full day in such conditions, because the body might endure but the mind would break. And in the nights when the frost crept into your bones and the sky pressed down with silence, many asked themselves how many more days could possibly come, and whether morning would ever feel like morning again. When you think about how soldiers tried to endure the endless hours, you have to imagine that time itself seemed to lose meaning, because sunrise and sunset were often hidden behind layers of gray cloud, smoke, or blowing snow, and the days stretched without sharp edges, one blending into the next, until weeks became an unbroken blur of exhaustion. Many men said they lost track of what month it was, what season they were supposed to be in, because the Eastern Front offered only two sensations: the cruel cold that locked every muscle in ice, and the brief, suffocating heat that came when spring turned the plains into oceans of mud, sucking boots down into the earth and swallowing wagons whole. In such conditions, the mind became fragile. A soldier would sit and stare at the small flame of a candle, watching the wax drip, counting each drop as though it were a measure of life itself, and sometimes he would mutter the names of towns he remembered, the street where he was born, the sound of church bells on a summer morning, or the smell of bread baking in his mother's kitchen, because holding on to those memories was the only way to remind himself that he had once lived in another world, a world where there were clean sheets, warm meals, laughter, and silence that did not come from death but from peace. The rations that arrived were often late, sometimes spoiled, sometimes stolen before they reached the men, and so soldiers made do with what they could scavenge. They boiled horse bones until they cracked and gave out a faint greasy broth. They scraped bark from trees to chew when the hunger became unbearable. They caught stray dogs or cats when villages were deserted, and though many were ashamed to admit it, hunger does not leave room for pride, so they ate whatever they could find, swallowing quickly, telling themselves it was only for survival. Salt was a treasure, sugar was a memory, coffee was a dream that belonged to another universe. Entertainment was not just a pastime but a weapon against despair. When supplies included newspapers or books, men passed them around until the pages turned soft and ragged, and they read aloud, even if the words were old or irrelevant, because listening to someone's voice reciting a story or a poem could transport them, if only for a few minutes, away from the snow and mud and smoke. Songs became bridges to home, and when voices lifted together, echoing across a campfire or a bunker, the sound carried with it something more powerful than rations or ammunition. It carried the memory of being human. But the truth was that humanity frayed at the edges. Lice spread fever, frostbite turned fingers black, dysentery weakened men until they could barely stand, and yet orders still came, demanding marches, digging trenches, building fortifications, standing watch in the dead of night when the temperature dropped lower than a man thought possible. Sleep was shallow, broken by the crash of shells or the cries of the wounded, and when dawn came, no one truly felt rested. They only felt slightly less broken than the day before. The front was not simply battles and victories or defeats. It was an ocean of waiting, of standing in frozen mud with a rifle slung across the shoulder, staring at a horizon that seemed never to move, and feeling the minutes drip slowly like melting icicles. And yet, at any moment, that waiting could shatter, because the silence might break with the crack of rifle fire, the scream of incoming shells, the sudden roar of tanks crawling across the earth, and in that instant men who were half asleep, half starved, half frozen had to become soldiers again, had to fight with whatever strength was left in them, though their minds often floated elsewhere, clinging to the thought of survival rather than the thought of victory. One of the cruelties of the Eastern Front was how it stripped away the idea of seasons as cycles of renewal. In spring, instead of flowers and warmth, there was only mud so deep that carts overturned, boots were lost, bodies sank into the filth, and whole units moved like snails through the sucking ground. In summer, instead of sunlit days, there was the constant stench of decay as corpses thawed and swarms of flies filled the air, carrying disease and laying eggs in wounds that refused to heal. In autumn, Instead of harvest and abundance, there was scarcity, burned fields, abandoned villages with orchards stripped bare, and nights that grew longer and colder with every passing day. And in winter, instead of snow that sparkled, there was an endless white void that swallowed the horizon. A silence so vast it pressed on the skull, broken only by the coughing of sick men or the distant boom of artillery. Men sought warmth in any way they could, wrapping themselves in extra layers of rags, stuffing straw into boots, using newspapers as insulation under their shirts, holding their hands over tiny fires made of damp twigs, and still the cold found them. There are accounts of men falling asleep in guard posts and never waking, their bodies frozen in the same position, rifles clutched in hands that turned stiff as wood. Others marched until their feet blackened, but they kept moving because stopping meant death. At night, when darkness was absolute, soldiers stared upward, searching for stars through the veil of smoke, and sometimes they wondered if anyone on the other side of that sky thought of them, if anyone still remembered their names, or whether they had already become just another number in a long list of casualties. And though they would never say it aloud, many feared not dying, but being forgotten, because the endless fields of the Eastern Front were littered with bones that no one would ever bury, with names that would never again be spoken in a warm house. It is difficult to explain how men endured this, because endurance was not a matter of strength or courage alone. It was a matter of habit, of falling into a rhythm where suffering became normal, where hunger was constant, where death was expected, where the horizon never promised escape. You would not last a day not because the body could not march or lift a rifle, but because the mind, accustomed to comfort and warmth and choice, would shatter under the weight of endless deprivation. And yet, within this nightmare, there were small moments of fragile beauty. A loaf of bread shared among comrades, a letter that arrived miraculously through the chaos of war, a photograph pulled from a pocket and passed around by candlelight, a bird that landed on a branch in the middle of winter, reminding the men that life still existed beyond the battlefield. These moments were tiny, fleeting, but they kept the human spirit from vanishing completely, and sometimes they were enough to carry a man through another night, another march, another day of survival on the Eastern Front. When you begin to picture the rhythm of a day on the Eastern Front, you have to understand that there was rarely such a thing as a clear beginning or end, because orders arrived at strange hours, movements were forced at midnight, and sometimes men marched until sunrise only to collapse in shallow trenches where they were told to dig without rest. The mornings that did exist were not gentle awakenings but jolts into awareness, triggered by the whistle of shells overhead or the bark of a commander who demanded that men rise immediately, shake the frost from their coats, and prepare to move. There was no coffee pot waiting, no hot water, no soft bread, only the harsh scrape of frozen rations against teeth, or sometimes nothing at all, only the bitter taste of an empty stomach that groaned louder than the wind. The first task of many mornings was clearing snow from weapons, because frost built up in the barrel, and without careful cleaning a rifle could betray its owner, misfiring at the exact moment when it was most needed. Soldiers learned to dismantle their rifles with stiff, swollen fingers, blowing into the metal to melt the ice, using scraps of cloth to wipe the chamber, cursing quietly when numb hands refused to grip the tiny parts. Ammunition had to be checked constantly because moisture ruined it, and every bullet was precious, each one representing a potential chance to survive the next encounter. After weapons came the business of the body. Boots were inspected, socks were wrung out if they were wet, feet were rubbed until circulation returned, because frostbite was always waiting, ready to claim toes, then feet, then legs. Men wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they could find, sometimes tearing shirts into strips to make crude bandages for blistered skin, sometimes stuffing straw or paper inside their boots. And still the cold worked its way inward, cruel and patient. Marches could last hours, dragging through landscapes that looked endless, fields scarred with shell craters, forests stripped of branches, villages abandoned and burned until only chimneys remained standing like gravestones. The sound of boots against frozen ground became mechanical, and men stopped speaking, each lost in his own inner world of exhaustion, counting steps, counting breaths, waiting for someone to shout an order that would allow them to halt. The air was filled with smells that never left. Smoke from fires, manure from overworked horses, the sour stench of unwashed bodies, and the unmistakable odor of death lingering from unburied corpses. When a halt came, there was rarely rest. Trenches had to be dug, even in ground that was hard as stone. Men hacked at the earth with picks, their breath turning into clouds that hung in the air, their hands blistered and raw. Trenches offered little comfort, only shallow lines that filled with water when the snow melted, or froze into ice when the temperature dropped. But they were the only defense against artillery and machine guns. Sitting inside them meant sitting in mud that soaked through every layer, mud that crawled into boots, mud that clung to hands, mud that smelled of decay, and soldiers lived with it day after day until mud became as familiar as their own skin. Meals, when they arrived, were taken without ceremony. The distribution of rations was often chaotic, men lining up with tin cans or dented pots, waiting for a ladle of thin soup or a chunk of bread, sometimes sharing, sometimes hoarding, sometimes trading with others for cigarettes or scraps of sugar. Cigarettes were more than luxury. They were a form of currency, a comfort, and a ritual. A soldier would light one, draw the smoke deep into his lungs, close his eyes, and for a moment feel almost human again, as though the cigarette linked him to the world outside the front. Evenings were marked by fatigue rather than relaxation. When darkness fell, patrols had to be sent out, watch posts had to be manned, equipment had to be repaired by candlelight or in total darkness. Sleep came in short bursts, often interrupted by alarms, artillery fire, or the groans of the wounded. Men curled against each other for warmth, covering themselves with coats stiff from frost, trying not to think about the lice crawling in the seams or the rats that scurried across the floor of the dugout. Rats were everywhere, feeding on scraps, chewing holes in packs, bold enough to crawl across sleeping bodies. Some soldiers trapped them, roasted them, ate them, because hunger stripped away disgust. Letters were treasures. When mail arrived, men tore envelopes with trembling fingers, eyes scanning words over and over, lips moving silently as though reciting prayers. Letters were read until the paper frayed, folded carefully, tucked into pockets close to the heart. Photographs were kissed, sometimes wept over, sometimes passed around to comrades who pretended not to notice the tears. For those who received no letters, the silence was heavier than hunger. Some invented letters aloud, whispering words they wished someone had written to them, creating a comfort that existed only in imagination. And then there was the noise. Artillery thundered day and night, a constant reminder that death hovered always at the edge of sight. The sound became so familiar that silence felt unnatural, so that when the guns paused, men grew restless, waiting for the next explosion, knowing it would come. The ground trembled, the air shuddered, ears rang until hearing became dull. Yet men carried on because what choice was there? The cruelty of the Eastern Front was not only in the violence but in the repetition, the endless cycle of hunger, cold, mud, exhaustion, waiting, marching, digging, firing, sleeping in fragments, waking to do it again without certainty, without escape. And it is here that you begin to understand why no one today could imagine surviving even a single day in such conditions, because it was not a matter of a single hardship, but of countless hardships layered endlessly, each one eating away at the body, each one crushing the mind, until survival itself became less about living and more about refusing to die just a little longer. And still, men found ways to carry pieces of themselves forward. A song hummed softly in the dark, a carved figure made from a scrap of wood, a joke whispered around a fire, a memory retold to anyone who would listen. These small acts, fragile as they were, kept something human alive within them, and perhaps that was the greatest act of defiance on the Eastern Front, the refusal to let misery erase the last fragments of the human spirit. If you imagine the rare moments when soldiers were not marching or digging or firing or freezing, you might expect that rest brought comfort. Yet on the Eastern Front even rest carried its own weight of suffering, because to rest meant to sink deeper into the reality of where you were, to lie in the damp earth of a dugout, to hear the dripping of water from frost melting above your head, to feel the crawling of lice across your skin, to listen to the distant thunder of artillery that never truly ceased. Still, men clung to these pauses, because however miserable they were, they gave the illusion of safety, and even an illusion could be enough to calm a weary mind for a few hours. If you imagine the rare moments when soldiers were not marching or digging or firing or freezing, you might expect that rest brought comfort. Yet on the Eastern Front, even rest carried its own weight of suffering, because to rest meant to sink deeper into the reality of where you were, to lie in the damp earth of a dugout, to hear the dripping of water from frost melting above your head, to feel the crawling of lice across your skin, to listen to the distant thunder of artillery that never truly ceased. Still, men clung to these pauses, because however miserable they were, they gave the illusion of safety, and even an illusion could be enough to calm a weary mind for a few hours. Inside the dugouts, where air was heavy and stank of smoke and sweat, soldiers tried to fill the silence with conversation, though conversation often circled the same subjects: home, food, memories of childhood, the names of streets they might never see again. Someone might pull out a harmonica, and though his fingers were stiff with cold, he would press them against the metal, coaxing out a thin tune that filled the gloom with a sound almost too fragile to survive, and others would hum along, each carrying the melody in his own thoughts, letting it blend with his memories. Another might carve small figures from wood, shaping them carefully with a dull knife, passing the pieces around so that everyone could hold something that was not a weapon, not a tool of war, but simply an object made by human hands. Cards were played with decks that had been used so often the corners were soft and blackened, the faces smudged. Yet still the soldiers shuffled them, dealing onto blankets or boxes, wagering nothing more than matches, scraps of bread, or sometimes only pride. The games were less about winning than about distracting the mind, keeping it occupied so that despair did not grow too strong. In these moments, laughter sometimes surfaced, not loud, not carefree, but a rough, tired laughter that acknowledged the absurdity of finding joy in the middle of endless misery. When rations were delivered and something unusual appeared, a piece of sausage, a handful of dried fruit, a tin of condensed milk, men treated it like treasure, cutting it into small pieces, passing it around, savoring each bite as though it were a feast. There were arguments sometimes, voices rising when food was unfairly divided, but more often there was a kind of unspoken agreement that survival depended on sharing, that holding too tightly to one's portion could isolate a man from his comrades, and isolation was dangerous, because no one survived alone on the Eastern Front. The seasons shaped everything. In spring, the thaw came, and with it the mud, endless mud that clung to boots and wheels, that pulled at legs until every step was a battle. Soldiers spoke of mud as though it were a living enemy, a force that swallowed wagons whole, that drowned horses, that made rifles and uniforms perpetually filthy. The mud carried disease, it stank of rot, it ruined supplies, it made every movement slow. Yet spring also brought the first hints of green, small buds on trees, birds returning to the sky, and in those fragile signs men saw reminders that the world outside the war continued to exist, though it felt impossibly far away. Summer should have meant relief, but on the Eastern Front it brought heat that turned trenches into ovens, that filled the air with clouds of flies, that caused wounds to fester, that exposed the rotting bodies buried shallow in the ground or left unburied in no man's land. The stench was overwhelming, clinging to clothes and skin until no amount of smoke could mask it. Men sweated constantly, uniforms soaked, water scarce, lips cracked from thirst, tongues swollen. Insects crawled across faces at night, buzzing in ears, biting skin until it bled. Yet in the long daylight hours there was also a strange beauty. Fields of wheat stretching golden under the sun, forests alive with sound, rivers where men bathed, laughing for the first time in weeks, splashing water that sparkled as though war had vanished for a moment. Autumn came with chill winds, rains that turned ground back into seas of mud, nights that grew longer and colder. Supplies of food dwindled as harvests were lost, villages stripped bare, orchards empty. Soldiers foraged desperately, boiling whatever they could find, roots, weeds, scraps left behind in abandoned barns. Nights were restless, filled with the rustle of rats searching for crumbs, with the coughing of sick comrades, with the scratching of lice. Yet autumn skies were also dramatic, sunsets painting clouds in shades of red and orange, and soldiers sometimes stood silently watching the horizon, remembering other autumns when life had been ordinary, when harvest meant abundance, when families gathered to celebrate rather than scatter in fear. Winter, though, was the true master of the Eastern Front. Temperatures fell so low that breath froze into icicles on mustaches. Rifles became brittle, oil in machinery thickened to tar. Fires refused to burn without constant tending. Men wrapped themselves in layers of rags until they looked like bundles of cloth. But still the cold crept in, numbing fingers, slowing blood, stiffening muscles. Frostbite claimed noses, ears, toes, fingers, and those who could still walk dragged the half-dead forward, refusing to let them fall, because leaving them behind felt like admitting that tomorrow might bring the same fate for yourself. Horses collapsed and froze where they fell, their bodies stiff on the roadside, their harnesses stripped for firewood, their flesh sometimes cut for meat despite the horror. The snow was endless, piling in drifts, reflecting light so that eyes ached, swallowing sound until the world felt empty. And yet, in the silence of winter nights, when the stars were sharp and cold above, men sometimes felt closer to something eternal, something larger than the war, though they could not name it. In every season, boredom and terror lived side by side. One day might pass in monotony, with nothing but waiting, digging, patrolling, scratching at lice, chewing on stale bread, dozing in fits. The next could explode in violence, shells raining down, ground shaking, men shouting, chaos spreading like fire. There was no rhythm that could be trusted, no guarantee that tomorrow would resemble today. The only certainty was uncertainty, and living inside that endless tension wore men down until they no longer dreamed of victory, only of survival, only of returning home to see once more the faces they carried in memory. And when you listen to their stories, when you read the diaries that survived or the letters smuggled home, you begin to understand that endurance was not about strength in the way we imagine it, but about the ability to accept endless hardship, to continue moving when every part of you wanted to stop, to laugh when there was nothing to laugh at, to share when there was nothing to share. And that is why those who endured the Eastern Front were changed forever, because they had lived through a world that stripped away everything familiar, leaving only the raw core of survival. When the night settled over the front lines, it did not bring rest. It brought a different kind of weight, because the hours of darkness were filled with dangers that daylight at least exposed. And in the blackness every sound became sharper, every whisper of wind against branches, every creak of ice, every step in the snow turned into a potential threat. Soldiers lay in their dugouts listening to the world above, ears straining to separate the natural noises from the human ones, wondering whether the faint crunch was a fox moving across the frozen ground or the careful tread of an enemy patrol. The nerves were stretched tight, and even the bravest men confessed in their journals that nights seemed endless, that the darkness pressed into the skin, and that it was not simply fear of bullets but fear of the unknown that gnawed at them most. Fear shaped everything, not only the obvious fear of being shot or shelled, but the deeper fear of losing oneself entirely, of becoming nothing more than a body among thousands, indistinguishable, forgotten. Men developed rituals to guard against this dread. Some muttered prayers before sleep, even if they had never been religious at home, whispering familiar words as though they were incantations against the blackness. Others carried charms, small crosses, photographs, scraps of cloth from home, objects that held no practical power but gave a fragile sense of control, because when everything else was unpredictable, a talisman could feel like an anchor. Superstitions spread quickly in the trenches. Soldiers avoided certain words, believing they would bring bad luck if spoken aloud. They counted the number of steps between posts and told themselves that if they kept the count even, the night would pass safely. They knocked on wood, spat 3 times over their shoulders, or tied knots and strings as protection against stray bullets. Rational minds might dismiss such acts, but on the Eastern Front, where life often seemed to hang by the thinnest of threads, any ritual, no matter how strange, could ease the mind. The psychology of waiting under bombardment was another torment altogether. When shells fell, the earth shook, the air vibrated, dust and dirt rained down, and there was nothing to do but crouch lower, press against the wall of the trench, and hope that the next explosion did not land directly overhead. Some men screamed, some prayed, some grew silent, staring blankly ahead as though already gone. The randomness of survival drove men toward madness, because there was no logic in who lived and who died, No pattern to explain why one dugout collapsed and another stood, why one man was torn apart while the comrade beside him remained untouched. It was the lottery of war, and living inside that lottery eroded certainty until every moment felt like borrowed time. And yet, when the bombardment ended, when the ringing in the ears subsided, soldiers dragged themselves out, brushed dirt from their uniforms, and returned to whatever task awaited, because there was no other choice. Some laughed hysterically, unable to stop, others shook uncontrollably, others lit cigarettes with trembling hands, sucking in smoke as though it were life itself. Fear lingered, but life demanded continuation, and the endless cycle went on. Nights also revealed the fragility of the human mind in quieter ways. Alone on watch, staring into a black horizon, a soldier might see shapes that were not there, phantoms moving between the trees, shadows that seemed to creep closer. Exhaustion and hunger warped perception, turning branches into advancing figures, turning distant sparks into approaching lanterns. Men admitted later that they fired blindly into the dark, convinced they saw enemies, only to find emptiness. The mind, deprived of light and rest, created its own enemies. Dreams, when sleep came, were another battlefield. Many men wrote of dreaming about food, endless feasts of bread, meat, wine, and fruit, only to wake with their mouths dry and their stomachs aching. Others dreamed of home, of family members sitting around a table, of warm beds, of summer fields, and waking was worse than any nightmare, because the return to reality was like being dragged from heaven into hell. Some dreamed of battles, reliving shellfire, seeing faces of the dead, waking in cold sweat, gripping their rifles as if the fight had followed them into sleep. Dreams became both escape and torment, depending on the night. Conversations during long nights often turned philosophical. Soldiers asked each other why they were there, whether anyone would remember them, whether history would even notice the nameless faces who froze and starved in these fields. Some argued about fate, about whether each man's death was already written or whether choices mattered. Others debated the smallest details, how to make boots last longer, which way to hold a rifle in the cold, how to keep matches dry. Serious talk and trivial talk blended, because both served the same purpose: to keep the silence from becoming unbearable. There were also rare nights of deceptive beauty. The sky could clear, the stars blazing in a dome so vast it humbled even the most hardened soldiers. The northern lights sometimes shimmered, green and purple curtains rippling across the heavens, and men fell silent, staring upward, forgetting for a moment the mud and the lice and the hunger. For those few minutes, they remembered that the world was larger than the front, that somewhere beyond the horizon life continued, that the war, vast as it seemed, was not the entirety of existence. And then the cold bit deeper, a distant shell exploded, and the spell broke, dragging them back to reality. In those endless nights, the strongest bond was not with commanders or distant leaders but with the comrade beside you, the man who shared his bread, who kept you awake when you threatened to freeze, who stood watch when your eyes could no longer stay open. Survival depended on this fragile brotherhood, a trust forged not in ideals but in necessity. You endured because someone needed you, and because you needed someone, and without that thread, fear would have devoured you entirely. And so, the night on the Eastern Front was not an escape from the day but an extension of it. Another chapter of hardship written in shadows and whispers, filled with fear, rituals, hallucinations, fragile beauty, and the constant question of whether morning would come, and whether you would still be alive to see it. If there was one truth that every man learned quickly on the Eastern Front, it was that survival did not depend only on the avoidance of bullets or shells, but on the accumulation of countless small decisions, the quiet improvisations that kept a body from slipping into death by hunger, cold, or neglect. And in this way the front became a long education in resourcefulness, where every object, no matter how insignificant, might gain a new use, and where each gesture of care for the body or equipment might mean the difference between another sunrise and a final collapse into the snow. Food, always scarce, forced ingenuity. Soldiers boiled whatever they could find, turning stale bread into soups thickened with bits of frozen horse meat scavenged from carcasses that lay stiff on the roadsides, the flesh hacked away with dull knives or even bayonets. then boiled in tin cans over small fires that barely smoked for fear of detection. Men roasted rats when nothing else remained, skinned them clumsily, salted them with the faint traces left at the bottom of ration bags, and ate with no shame, for hunger stripped away disgust until everything was judged by its power to fill the stomach. Sometimes they traded tobacco for a handful of potatoes stolen from an abandoned cellar. Sometimes they risked their lives to raid a barn under the cover of night, and every successful raid was celebrated as if it were a feast. Water, though seemingly abundant in a land of snow, was not always safe, and men melted snow in helmets, careful not to burn holes in the metal, drinking it warm when they could, icy when they could not, and often choking on the grit or ash that clung to it. In the summer months, water carried disease, and men filtered it through cloth, through socks, through anything, knowing it helped little but unable to stop the ritual. Dysentery haunted the camps like a shadow, and men joked about it grimly, yet feared it more than bullets, for it struck silently, drained the body, and left men too weak to carry their rifles. Clothing was patched again and again until uniforms became more stitched than fabric. Men wrapped rags around their feet when boots split, stuffed straw inside to hold in warmth, and tied rope around soles to keep them together. Mittens were fashioned from torn blankets, scarves from strips of burlap sacks, and even when lice crawled in every seam, the garments could not be discarded because replacements were rare. Lice were inevitable, and scratching became constant, a small background torment that never ceased. Soldiers joked bitterly that lice were the most loyal companions on the front, because unlike comrades, they never left. Weapons, too, required endless care, for the cold froze oil, rust crept in from damp, and a rifle that misfired at the wrong moment could mean death. Men slept with rifles beside them, sometimes wrapped in coats to shield them from frost, sometimes holding them as though they were extensions of their own bodies. Cleaning became ritual, a slow disassembly, each piece wiped with rags, breath-warming frozen metal, hands cracked and bleeding but steady. Some carved small marks into their rifle stocks, notches of survival rather than kills, a way of counting days lived rather than lives taken, though they rarely admitted the meaning aloud. Improvisation was everywhere. Empty tins became stoves, broken helmets became basins, discarded wires became snares for rabbits, when rabbits could be found, though often only silence answered the traps. Candle stubs were treasures, their wax melted to seal holes in boots, their flames rationed for warmth or light during long nights of writing letters that might never be delivered. A scrap of paper served multiple purposes: writing, kindling, patching holes in walls of dugouts, and nothing was wasted, because waste was unthinkable in a world where every resource meant endurance. Letters themselves were lifelines, written with shaking hands, folded carefully, sometimes never sent, sometimes carried for weeks in pockets before a courier could be found. The words were often the same: assurances of health, expressions of longing, promises of return. But the act of writing steadied the mind, made life beyond the front real, gave shape to the hope that there was something waiting outside the mud and cold. And when letters from home arrived, men passed them around, not to read the words but simply to touch the paper, to breathe in the faint smell of another life. Firewood became as valuable as food. Men risked patrols to cut branches, sometimes hauling entire logs across fields, sweating despite the cold, because without fire, death crept in silently. Fires were built low, shielded with stones or snow, kept from flaring too bright, and men huddled close, hands stretched, faces glowing red, voices dropping into murmurs. Around those fires, stories were told, lies and truths mingled, and for brief hours the front seemed distant, until the flames died down and the reality of darkness pressed in again. Hygiene, though nearly impossible, was pursued with desperation, because filth bred disease, and disease killed as surely as shells. Soldiers scraped teeth with twigs, shaved with dull blades when they could, washed socks in icy streams, even stripped to the waist in winter to scrub themselves with snow, gasping from the shock but grateful for the feeling of something clean. The smell of unwashed bodies hung heavy, and some grew used to it, while others never ceased to notice, writing bitterly in diaries about the stench of humanity reduced to survival. Sleep, that most fragile of needs, was stolen in fragments. Dugouts provided little warmth, but men curled together, back to back, body heat shared, boots left on because to remove them was to risk frostbite. Dreams came quickly, often heavy, sometimes so deep that comrades had to shake each other awake to prove they were still alive. And yet sleep was also feared, for in the cold a man could slip into unconsciousness and never return. And so sentries shook sleepers awake regularly, a cruel kindness that kept them in the realm of the living. Every act of survival was small, almost invisible, and yet in their accumulation they formed the fragile fabric of endurance. A strip of cloth, a handful of straw, a scrap of bread, a few drops of melted snow, a gesture of shared warmth. None of these things seemed monumental, yet together they built the wall that kept death, ever waiting at the edge of the trenches, from stepping inside. The front was not only a war of weapons and strategies, but a war of daily survival, a contest of patience, improvisation, and endurance, where the smallest resource was guarded like treasure, and where men learned to value things once ignored, discovering that life, reduced to its barest elements, depended on the things that in peace would have seemed trivial, but in war became sacred. War, though often spoken of in terms of soldiers, of armies that clashed in lines that advanced or retreated, was never confined only to the men in uniform, because between the trenches and beyond the front lines lay villages and towns, and within them the civilians whose lives unfolded in parallel to the army's struggles, not as combatants but as the silent witnesses and reluctant participants in a tragedy they had not chosen. And in this way the Eastern Front became not merely a battlefield, but a landscape where entire populations drifted between hunger, fear, and exhaustion, caught in the crossfire of forces far beyond their control. For soldiers trudging through burned villages, the first sign of civilian presence was often the silence, because whole streets stood abandoned, doors swung loose on hinges, windows shattered, and smoke rose from chimneys where no people remained, the ghostly remnants of lives lived before the war swept over them. Houses stood hollow, their walls stripped for firewood, their barns emptied of grain, and yet sometimes behind broken shutters one could see the pale face of a woman, a child, an old man, watching silently, waiting for the soldiers to pass. They rarely spoke, and even when they did, the words came out in broken whispers, half pleas, half curses, because they had seen too many armies already and trusted none of them. Civilians carried the war on their bodies. Women wore layers of patched cloth, shawls faded from years of use, boots stuffed with straw like the soldiers themselves, faces gaunt from lack of food. Children clung to their mothers, eyes too large for their thin faces, their voices hushed, their games forgotten, their laughter silenced. Old men hobbled with sticks, their backs bent, their eyes clouded with both age and sorrow, because they had seen wars before and understood that this one would leave scars not just on the land, but on every generation to follow. Food was as scarce for them as for the armies. Villagers boiled weeds and bark, ground acorns into coarse flour, baked bread that tasted of earth and bitterness. They slaughtered their last chickens, their last goats, their last cows, often under the eyes of soldiers who would take what remained, sometimes with payment, often without. Hunger hollowed out homes as surely as shells hollowed out buildings, and every family knew the language of starvation, the slow withering of bodies, the quiet fading of voices, the long nights spent listening to stomachs growl with no relief in sight. In the winter, cold became another enemy. Windows were stuffed with rags, roofs patched with whatever scraps could be found, stoves fed with broken furniture. Families huddled together in single rooms, blankets piled on top of them, breath visible in the air even indoors, and still the frost crept in, biting through layers, turning water into ice inside basins, leaving frost on walls. Sometimes whole families froze in their homes, discovered later by soldiers who entered seeking shelter and found only silence and stillness. Villages themselves bore the scars of passing armies. Barns burned, fields trampled, wells fouled, livestock driven away, and fences torn down for fuel. Churches stood with shattered windows, icons charred or stolen, bells silent, their towers sometimes toppled by artillery, and the sacred spaces became barracks, stables, or simply ruins where no one prayed anymore. Cemeteries filled with shallow graves, some marked with crude crosses, others left unmarked because time and strength to bury properly no longer remained. Refugees walked the roads endlessly, carts piled with belongings, wheels creaking, women pulling children along, men carrying sacks over their shoulders, all of them moving because to stay meant starvation or violence, and yet to move meant the same, only elsewhere. Their faces were blank, their voices low, and soldiers passing them on the road rarely spoke, because they saw in them a mirror of their own exhaustion, a reflection of what it meant to be dispossessed, stripped of safety, of home, of the certainty of tomorrow. Sometimes soldiers and civilians crossed paths not in hostility but in fragile exchanges. A soldier might share a crust of bread, a handful of sugar, a cigarette, and in return receive a smile, a nod, perhaps an apple from a hidden store. There were brief moments of kindness, sparks of humanity that glimmered against the backdrop of destruction. And though they were fleeting, men remembered them, wrote about them in letters home, spoke of them quietly around campfires, because such moments proved that not all was cruelty, that survival could still include fragments of compassion. But just as often, the encounters were brutal. Armies requisitioned grain, horses, livestock. Soldiers searched homes for hidden food. Civilians were forced to guide units through forests or across rivers. Some resisted, some complied, but all lived under the knowledge that refusal could mean punishment, and punishment on the Eastern Front was merciless. Executions were carried out in village squares, homes burned as warnings, families scattered, and the memory of such acts lingered not only in the minds of survivors but in the soil itself, so that years later people still spoke of villages that had been erased, of families that had vanished. For the soldiers, civilians were a reminder of what they had lost. Homes, families, the rhythm of ordinary life. Seeing a woman cook over a fire, hearing a child cry, watching old men smoke pipes on broken porches. These sights brought memories rushing back, sometimes comforting, sometimes unbearable. Letters home became heavier after such encounters, filled with longing, with descriptions of strangers' lives that stirred their own yearning for the lives they once had. And yet the war pressed forward, erasing those glimpses as quickly as it revealed them, because the front allowed no permanence, only passage. Civilians endured, as they always do, through silence, through adaptation, through resilience that was never celebrated but without which whole regions would have emptied completely. They harvested under shellfire, fetched water from wells at dawn before soldiers awoke, rebuilt walls with bare hands, taught children songs to distract them from hunger. Their survival was quiet, invisible, almost overlooked by the histories that later recorded the battles and the generals. But without them, the landscape of the front would have been nothing but emptiness. It was their persistence, their refusal to vanish entirely, that kept the land from becoming only a graveyard. And so the soldiers marched through villages, sometimes welcomed, sometimes feared, always watched, and behind every shuttered window, every half-collapsed barn, every stretch of empty road, the presence of civilians lingered, shaping the war in ways unspoken, reminding the men that they were not alone in their suffering, that the front was not just trenches and guns but a vast human tragedy that touched everyone who lived within its reach, soldier and civilian alike. War on the Eastern Front was never still for long, because armies rarely rested in the same place more than a few days before orders came to move again, to advance or retreat, to cross forests and fields, rivers and marshes. And in this constant shifting, the soldiers found that their lives became measured not in victories or defeats, but in the rhythm of footsteps, in the endless repetition of left and right, the weight of packs pressing down on shoulders, the mud pulling at boots, the road stretching forward without end. The march was both a punishment and a refuge. It punished the body, blistering the feet, grinding the knees, bending the spine under the load of rifle and gear, yet it also provided the only form of certainty, because when men marched they knew at least what to do, to put one foot in front of the other, to follow the man ahead, to endure the moment until the next halt. There was no strategy for the common soldier in the column, only movement, only the road, only the horizon that always seemed to recede as they approached. The road itself was never the same twice. In spring it was a swamp, sucking boots down into sticky depths, swallowing horses, overturning wagons. In summer it was dust, thick clouds rising with each step, coating mouths and throats, filling lungs until every breath tasted of earth. In autumn it was rain, constant, turning every mile into a river of mud, soaking uniforms until they clung heavy and cold. In winter it froze solid, rutted by wheels and hooves, sharp ice cutting through worn boots, frost biting into skin, breath streaming white into the air like smoke. Marches blurred time. Hours became indistinguishable from days, and days from weeks. Soldiers marched until their eyes burned with exhaustion, until they stumbled half asleep, waking only when they fell or when the man behind them shoved them forward. Songs were sometimes sung to keep rhythm, but even the songs slowed, faltered, broke into silence as fatigue stole the voices. Silence became the companion of the march, a silence broken only by the creak of leather, the clank of mess tins, the groan of wagons, the low mutter of orders passed down the line. Food on the march was uncertain. Rations, when distributed, were often eaten immediately, leaving nothing for later, and so men scavenged along the way, pulling apples from orchards, digging into abandoned gardens, slaughtering animals left behind by fleeing civilians. Some carried turnips or hard bread tucked into pockets, gnawed in secret while trudging forward, while others went without, lips cracked, stomachs hollow, waiting for the next halt when perhaps a field kitchen might appear, steaming kettles giving out thin soup, thick with smell if not with substance. Sleep was a rare gift. At halts, men collapsed on roadside ditches, in barns, in open fields, wherever they fell. Some did not even remove their packs, too weary to unbuckle straps, too certain that the order to rise and march again would come before they had fully sunk into rest. Nights on the march were colder, darker, lonelier than any in the trenches, because the road stretched out into blackness, stars overhead indifferent, the line of men weaving through shadows like ghosts, their movements mechanical, their thoughts dulled by exhaustion. There were always stragglers, men who fell behind, who could not keep pace, whose legs failed them. Officers sometimes pushed them back into the line, sometimes left them where they dropped, sometimes punished them with harsh words or harsher blows, but the road did not wait. A man who fell could be swallowed by the landscape, left behind as the column disappeared into the distance. Stories were whispered of stragglers found later, half buried in mud, stiff with frost, or wandering aimlessly, packs discarded, eyes vacant, no longer soldiers but shadows of men. Retreats were worse than advances, because in retreat the pace quickened, urgency gnawed at every step, the sense of being pursued hung over the column like a shadow. Villages passed through in retreat were left in ruin, carts burned, supplies abandoned, bridges destroyed behind them. Soldiers marched with heads down, avoiding each other's eyes, because retreat felt like shame even when it was necessity, and the footsteps on the frozen ground sounded louder, more desperate, as though the earth itself mocked their backward movement. Advances, too, were exhausting, though cloaked in the language of progress. Men were told they were pushing forward, gaining ground, yet to them it was only more miles, more rivers to cross, more forests to stumble through. The advance meant longer hours, fewer halts, heavier loads as supply lines lagged behind. It meant collapsing into villages still smoldering from bombardment, sleeping in barns that smelled of ash and blood, and rising again at dawn to continue forward into landscapes just as empty, just as hostile. The march created its own strange camaraderie. Men marched shoulder to shoulder, boots striking in rhythm, and though they rarely spoke, they felt the weight of each other's endurance. A stumble corrected by a comrade's hand, a canteen shared in silence, a pack adjusted by another without a word. These small acts formed bonds as strong as those forged in combat. Yet these bonds were built not on glory but on suffering, on the knowledge that all endured the same unending road, the same hunger, the same exhaustion. For the Eastern Front was not defined only by battles but by movement, by the ceaseless shifting of armies across vast distances, by the knowledge that no place was secure, no ground permanent. Villages taken one day were abandoned the next. Forests marched through in summer were crossed again in winter. Rivers that froze solid beneath boots later swelled in spring to sweep away bridges and drown men who tried to ford them. The war was not a line but a circle, and the marches carried soldiers again and again over the same ground until it seemed the road itself was endless, a path that led nowhere but back into itself. And so men marched on, eyes glazed, lips cracked, shoulders bent, boots worn thin, not with the conviction of victory or the hope of rest, but with the dull acceptance that marching was the shape of their lives, that the road was as inevitable as hunger, as cold, as war itself, and that as long as orders came they would move forward or backward or sideways, until even the difference between advance and retreat dissolved into the rhythm of endless footsteps carrying them through the vast and indifferent land. The Eastern Front was not only an enemy of men through battle and blood, but also through the endless turning of the seasons, because war there was never fought in a single climate, never bound to one unchanging condition, but rather carried along by the vast rhythm of the year, and soldiers discovered that each season was not a reprieve but another face of hardship, another layer of slow and grinding torment that reshaped their lives without mercy. Spring came first, not as a gentle awakening but as a slow drowning, because the snow did not vanish quietly. It melted into rivers and lakes and swamps, into sucking mud that swallowed carts and horses and men alike. Roads dissolved into brown torrents, boots filled with water at every step, and the land itself seemed to resist movement, clinging to every soul and wheel until progress became a nightmare of sucking footsteps and broken axles. Streams overflowed their banks, bridges collapsed under swollen currents, and soldiers found themselves building makeshift crossings from felled trees, their hands raw, their uniforms soaked, their bodies shivering even as the air began to warm. The mud of spring was said to have no bottom, and when a boot was pulled free with a slurp, it sometimes left a foot bare, the leather swallowed by the earth forever. Summer followed, and though the ground hardened, relief did not come, because the heat rose merciless, pressing down on helmets, burning through cloth, baking dust into every crease of skin. The sun in the wide open plains offered no shelter, no shade, and soldiers marched under skies that seemed to blaze without end. Water grew scarce, canteens ran dry, lips cracked and bled, and when water was found it was often drawn from ditches, green with algae, or from wells fouled by corpses, yet men drank all the same, because thirst gnawed more sharply than fear of sickness. Flies swarmed on sweat, on food, on wounds, their buzzing constant, their presence unavoidable, and the stench of death rose heavier in summer, carried by heat until entire stretches of countryside reeked with the sweet, cloying odor of rot. Nights were no relief, for they brought swarms of mosquitoes, whining in clouds, piercing skin until soldiers scratched themselves bloody in the darkness, their faces swollen, their sleep shattered. Autumn returned with rain, endless rain that seemed to fall without pause, soft at times, torrential at others, but always enough to soak uniforms, to chill bodies, to turn every step into a slog. The fields turned into lakes, trenches filled to the brim, fires sputtered and died in sodden wood, and everything smelled of wet earth, of damp straw, of decay. Bread went soft in packs, matches dissolved into pulp, blankets grew moldy, and men slept in mud that seeped through clothes and into bones. Villages passed through in autumn seemed ghostly, their thatched roofs sagging under the weight of water, their chimneys dripping, their walls streaked with black stains, and in these ruined places soldiers huddled, trying to escape the endless drizzle that blurred the horizon into gray. The sky itself seemed to sag lower in autumn, heavy with clouds, pressing down until men felt buried not only in mud but in the very air. Then came winter, harshest of all, a season that crushed armies as thoroughly as battle, because the cold on the Eastern Front was not simply cold. It was a force that stripped life from flesh, that stiffened rifles, that froze bread into bricks, that killed as silently as any bullet. Boots cracked, fingers blackened, faces stiffened with frost until expression was lost. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, in straw stuffed into coats, in blankets torn from abandoned houses. Yet still they shivered, their teeth rattling through the night, their breath steaming into the frozen air until it formed icicles on mustaches and lashes. Fires, when they could be built, gave only the smallest islands of warmth, and men clustered around them like moths, turning hands again and again, trying to thaw fingers that refused to bend. The ground grew iron hard, unyielding to shovels, so trenches became shallow. dug only where earth allowed, leaving men exposed to wind that sliced like blades. Sleep in winter was dangerous, because the body slowed, the blood cooled, and a man who lay down without shelter risked never rising again, found stiff and pale by his comrades at dawn. Seasons on the Eastern Front did not alternate with kindness but with cruelty, each arriving as though to remind soldiers that suffering was not tied only to the clash of armies but to the very passage of time itself. The year turned not as a wheel of renewal but as a cycle of different agonies, each one replacing the last without granting relief. Spring drowned, summer burned, autumn soaked, winter froze, and through it all the war continued, the guns firing, the orders given, the marches forced, the deaths mounting, until men no longer longed for the next season, because they knew it would bring only another form of misery, another endless trial to endure. In this way, the soldiers came to feel that time itself was an enemy, that the months were battalions, the seasons commanders, the year a campaign against their bodies and their wills, and that to survive meant not only surviving battle but surviving the weather, the mud, the heat, the rain, the frost, the very turning of the earth beneath their weary boots. Between the marches and the battles, between the long columns that dragged across roads and the sudden bursts of fire and thunder that tore the sky apart, there existed another kind of time, a time of waiting, of endless camp life, when soldiers were not advancing or retreating but simply existing, caught in the long gray stretches of stillness that seemed to stretch on longer than the marches themselves. For monotony has a way of weighing heavier than motion, and silence can be as oppressive as sound. In the camps there was no comfort, no true reprieve, only a different arrangement of discomfort, a shifting of misery from one form into another, because the ground was always either too hard or too wet, the air either too cold or too thick, and the makeshift shelters gave only partial relief, leaving men half protected, half exposed, neither warm nor dry, neither asleep nor awake, always suspended in a state of half-existence. Tents sagged under rain, flaps rattled in the wind, ropes frayed, poles broke, and when no tents could be raised, men simply lay in ditches or under wagons, their bodies curled into themselves, their breath fogging in the dark. Days in camp were filled with tasks that never ended, for rest was never rest. It was digging new trenches, hauling water from distant wells, chopping wood that was always damp, carrying crates that were always heavy, repairing boots with thread that never held, patching uniforms with cloth that never matched, and standing in lines that always stretched far too long, waiting for bread, waiting for soup, waiting for pay that seldom came. The routine was a circle, repetitive and without variation. The same gestures repeated by thousands of hands, the same muttered complaints carried through the air, the same coughs echoing through the night. Meals in camp were moments of gathering, yet they brought little joy, for the food was thin, the bread hard, the soup watery, and the portions never enough. Men ate quickly, not because of hunger alone, but because they feared the pot would empty before their turn, and when the last ladle scraped the bottom, silence would fall, broken only by the sound of chewing, by the crack of teeth on crust, by the slurp of liquid that was more water than nourishment. Hunger was a constant companion, not sharp enough to kill, but always gnawing, always reminding, always present in the hollowness of the belly. Nights in camp were long, broken by the coughing of the sick, the muttering of the restless, the distant cry of animals, the shifting of guards whose footsteps crunched softly on gravel or squelched in mud. Fires burned low, their embers glowing faintly, their warmth fading quickly, and around them men huddled, their shadows stretching thin across the ground, their faces hollowed by flickering light. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, broken by dreams of home, by the sting of cold, by the ache in limbs that never found true rest. Sickness spread easily in the camps, moving faster than bullets, carried in water, in air, in touch, invisible and unstoppable. Fevers rose, bodies shook, lips cracked with thirst, and men lay under blankets that smelled of mildew, whispering prayers or curses that went unheard. Doctors had little to give, their supplies always too few, their hands always too tired, their words always the same: endure, endure, endure. And so men endured, even as their strength drained, even as their skin grew pale, even as the camp itself seemed to breathe sickness into every corner. Yet within the monotony of the camps there also existed small rituals, quiet fragments of humanity clinging stubbornly to the edges of survival. A soldier might whittle a piece of wood into a figure, carving slowly with a dull knife, his hands steady not from patience but from the absence of anything else to do. Another might hum a tune from childhood, the sound faint, nearly swallowed by the crackle of fire, but still carried into the ears of those nearby, who might remember their own songs, their own homes, their own past lives. Letters were written, though paper was scarce and ink rarer still, and many words never reached their destinations. Yet men wrote anyway, pressing their thoughts into fragile sheets, folding them carefully, and trusting them to chance. Time in the camps was a blur, not counted by clocks or calendars but by the slow rhythm of chores, of meals, of nights that felt longer than days. Men grew older without noticing, their faces lined not by years but by weariness, their eyes dulled not by age but by endless sameness. The camps were places where nothing seemed to happen and yet everything happened, because the waiting itself was an act of endurance, as grinding and consuming as the marches and the battles, and the silence that hung over them was heavy with all the words unspoken, all the thoughts unshared, all the lives suspended between one order and the next. In this way the camps became a kind of battlefield of their own, one without gunfire, without explosions, but filled with slow attrition. A war fought not against men but against emptiness, against hunger, against cold, against time itself, and those who survived were not always the strongest or the bravest, but simply those who managed to continue breathing through the endless monotony of waiting. In the constant gray of the camps and the long stretches of roads that led through mud and broken forests, men learned quickly that their survival often depended not only on themselves but on the presence of another human body nearby, another pair of eyes scanning the horizon, another hand that might lift a crate, pass a cup, or steady a falling comrade, and yet this reliance was a delicate thing, fragile as a thread stretched over fire, for trust could be given freely one moment and shattered the next, and in the silence between orders, in the pauses between chores, men discovered the strange contradictions of companionship that were born not out of choice but necessity. They spoke in whispers, careful not to be overheard by guards or officers, and shared small scraps of food, a piece of bread, a spoonful of thin soup, sometimes even a rationed cigarette, holding on to these gestures like tiny lifelines in the vast emptiness that surrounded them. Some men would sit together by the dying embers of a fire, telling stories that were half memory, half invention, their words curling into the smoke, soft and fleeting, as if the fire itself would carry them away and preserve them somewhere beyond the reach of frost and rain. Laughter came rarely, thin and brittle, but when it arrived, it trembled across the camp like a sudden, fleeting sunbeam, brief, warm, and quickly gone, leaving the men shivering once more in the cold of reality. Yet not all bonds were warm. Among the lines of tents and makeshift shelters, suspicion moved like a shadow, slipping from man to man, fueled by exhaustion, hunger, and the knowledge that scarcity made even small kindnesses precious and dangerous. Eyes would narrow over a shared loaf of bread, hands would tighten over a coat pulled from the pile, and words left unspoken carried the weight of accusations, whispered warnings, and half-formed judgments. A glance could ignite anger or jealousy. A misstep could provoke a scowl. A failure to respond quickly enough might seed resentment that lingered for weeks. And in the slow, grinding monotony of camp life, these tiny conflicts expanded, curling quietly into corners of the mind until they became as real and as pressing as the physical discomfort that never left the men's bodies. Still, among the shadows, there were moments of care, often hidden, often unnoticed, gestures that carried the quiet insistence of life. One soldier might wrap a blanket more tightly around a younger, thinner comrade, adjusting the folds without ceremony, without looking up, hands moving with automatic precision learned from the repeated acts of survival. Another might fill the other's water canteen first, or save the larger portion of bread until the friend had eaten, acts so small they might go unrecognized, yet which bound the men together with threads finer than any command or order could. These threads were fragile, yet they were the only visible lifelines amid the relentless monotony and creeping despair, small cords of humanity connecting bodies that might otherwise be alone in the endless gray. Some bonds formed more visibly in the shared labor of camp life, when men carried crates together or worked to repair a broken wagon, their movements synchronized by repetition and necessity. Conversation was sparse, words chosen with care to avoid attention or conflict. Yet over the weeks, men came to anticipate the gestures of one another. A nod, a pause, a glance that conveyed understanding without speech. In these quiet synchronies, there was comfort, a sense that even if the world outside remained hostile, at least in these small actions, some measure of order and predictability could be found, some reassurance that one was not entirely alone. Conflicts, too, were inevitable. They surfaced over meager rations, over warmth at the fire, over perceived slights that might have been imagined, and they often resolved not in conversation but in avoidance, in a silent withdrawal, in the tense tightness of muscles when passing a tent or walking beside another man, or in words spoken in low tones that carried the weight of warning, threat, or quiet condemnation. These moments, though brief, added another layer to the camp's monotonous tapestry, revealing the constant negotiation between cooperation and self-preservation that defined life in this suspended world. Even as distrust flickered like a shadow, men learned to laugh at absurdities, to trade small jokes that passed quickly, unnoticed by officers, to tease one another over minor failures, spilling into brief moments of lightness before reality reclaimed them. These ephemeral levities were necessary, like the brief relief of stretching cramped muscles or the fleeting warmth of sunlight on a frozen morning. They reminded the men that even in the crushing monotony and relentless hardship, human connection, however fragile, persisted. It was in these moments, brief and precious, that men realized the paradox of their existence. They were bound to one another by necessity, sometimes by mutual regard, sometimes by shared suffering, and yet every bond carried the potential to fracture at a moment's notice, leaving each man once again suspended in solitude. In these camps, amid mud, cold, hunger, sickness, and quiet desperation, the paradox of human companionship became as palpable as the frost that crept along the tents, as pressing as the chill in the bones, as constant as the march of days that seemed to stretch into eternity. Bonds formed and broke, laughter flickered and vanished, kindness moved quietly through the ranks, and suspicion whispered in every shadow, weaving a pattern of human complexity against the backdrop of relentless monotony. And those who navigated these webs of connection found that survival was not only a matter of strength or skill, but also of patience, perception, and the careful cultivation of the fragile threads that kept men tethered to one another amid the unyielding landscape of war. The mornings began in a fog of damp cold, the kind that seeped into clothes and skin alike, gnawing quietly at bones already weary from the nights of restless sleep on hard, frozen ground. Men rose slowly, each movement deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if conserving strength against the invisible weight of another day, and the first thought that flickered into consciousness often centered on food, not warmth or orders or the long stretches of marching ahead, but the next morsel, the next sip of water, the tiny sustenance that defined survival, and even this was rationed, calculated, measured with a precision born from scarcity. Breakfast was rarely what the mind imagined in a peaceful home, and yet within the monotony of thin soup and stale bread, men discovered a rhythm, a sequence that became part of the day's quiet architecture. One man would dip the spoon with care, blow gently to cool the scalding liquid, and pass the ladle along, a small ceremony that acknowledged the presence of another body, a shared reliance upon the meager offerings provided. Bread, often hard and dry, became almost sacred, broken into uneven pieces, each fragment a gift, each swallow a small triumph over the gnawing emptiness in the stomach. Sometimes a small surprise appeared in the rations. A few scraps of meat, a piece of chocolate, a tin of condensed milk, rare treasures that sparked conversations that moved softly through the camp, whispered discussions of taste and texture and the fleeting luxury of sweetness on the tongue. And in these moments, men would gather quietly, comparing portions, trading small favors to share the delight, savoring in silence, careful not to attract attention from those who might envy or reprimand. A tin of condensed milk could inspire a small council, a negotiation over fractions of spoonfuls, an unspoken acknowledgement that this small act of sharing carried more significance than the mere calories consumed. Preparation of food was itself a slow, deliberate performance, each gesture a small defiance against the harshness of circumstance. Fires had to be coaxed into life, flint striking flint until sparks caught, careful attention paid to the direction of smoke, the dryness of twigs, the patience to wait until the flames could warm both food and body. Boiling water for soup required focus, hands numbed by cold, eyes scanning the surroundings, while the smell of cooking mingled with the scent of mud, sweat, and leather. A strange comfort that reminded the men of humanity amid the vast, impersonal machinery of war. In moments of leisure, which were rare and fleeting, men found small ways to improve the taste of their meager rations. A handful of wild herbs plucked from the edges of the camp, a pinch of salt saved from previous meals, a trace of dried fruit preserved carefully over weeks, each addition a minor rebellion, a reclamation of sensory pleasure from a world that had stripped away almost all comforts. These rituals were observed quietly, sometimes alone, sometimes with a neighbor whose company had become tolerable, a silent acknowledgement that even in the bleakest circumstances, there existed the possibility of small joys, and that savoring them required patience, attention, and a willingness to delay gratification in order to maximize the experience of each bite. Sharing food also revealed the subtleties of hierarchy and camaraderie. The older or more experienced men might pass larger portions to younger or weaker companions, or save the best piece for someone whose health seemed most fragile, acts carried out without fanfare, almost invisible, yet leaving impressions that lingered longer than any command or reprimand could. At the same time, men learned to watch for subtle cues, the shift of eyes, the hesitation of hands, the quiet way one reached for a loaf, understanding that a misstep could ignite tension or resentment, and thus, eating became not only a necessity but a delicate social exercise, a study in perception, patience, and the unspoken rules that governed existence in these constrained quarters. Evenings followed a similar pattern, the return to meager meals after long hours of labor or patrol, and the preparation was always accompanied by quiet observation, the low crackle of fire, the soft murmur of men exchanging thoughts, jokes, or recollections. When rations included something more substantial, the conversation lengthened, stretching into a subdued enjoyment of flavor, texture, warmth, and the rare security of a stomach temporarily full. Men learned to eat slowly, deliberately, aware that each mouthful was precious, aware that tomorrow might not offer the same satisfaction. And in this slow consumption, a rhythm emerged that structured the day, tethering them to routine, marking the hours with the simple certainty of ingestion and digestion, of survival enacted in the quietest, most essential acts of the body. Even small failures in these rituals carried weight. A dropped piece of bread, a spilled soup, a can that refused to open, or water too cold to boil efficiently could provoke frustration, quietly stewing beneath polite conversation, and yet these were minor irritations compared to the constant gnaw of hunger that defined existence on the Eastern Front. The men learned to adapt, to improvise, to find small joys in the occasional treat, to measure rations with care, to cultivate patience and appreciation for the few gifts that the world offered. And in this careful, meticulous engagement with the act of eating, they discovered a fragment of control in a life otherwise dominated by chaos, cold, and scarcity. As night fell, the faint scent of burnt wood mingled with the lingering aroma of cooked meals, and men retreated to their tents, blankets pulled tightly around shoulders, canteens emptied or partially consumed, and the lingering taste of food marking the slow closure of the day. Even in these small comforts, the shadow of hunger never fully dissipated, and men learned to carry both satisfaction and longing within themselves, aware that the struggle for nourishment was as relentless and demanding as any march, any battle, any task imposed by the unyielding machinery of war, and that mastery over these small acts of sustenance was itself a testament to endurance, discipline, and the quiet persistence of human will. Even in the relentless monotony of camp life, when the cold seeped through boots and gloves and the wind seemed intent on prying warmth from every layer of clothing, men sought moments of diversion, brief reprieves from the ceaseless demands of survival, and in these tiny interludes, a different kind of endurance was exercised. The endurance of boredom, the endurance of monotony, the endurance of waiting. Cards appeared on pieces of wood, improvised boards scratched into frozen earth, and dice, worn smooth from countless hands, rolled across makeshift surfaces as men huddled together, breath visible in the icy air, eyes intent on the small contest, the small distraction that allowed minds to wander beyond the immediate demands of rationed food, exhausting labor, or the ever-present shadow of enemy fire. Laughter, rare and muted, surfaced like a fragile bird in the midst of the cold, sharp and fleeting, sometimes at the expense of clumsiness. A misthrown die, a misplaced card, or a joke whispered quietly to avoid drawing attention. Men discovered subtle pleasures in these moments. The skill required to balance a small tin of soup on an uneven log while rolling dice, the camaraderie in teasing a comrade about a poor hand, the gentle ritual of exchanging small tokens for victories, all of it creating a delicate lattice of social bonds that stitched the day together, invisible yet vital. Beyond the games, there were rituals of movement, exercises performed almost mechanically, stretching stiff limbs, tapping frozen fingers, hopping in place to stir circulation, turning these simple acts into competitions of endurance or balance, challenges to see who could maintain the odd posture longest or who could perform the smallest tricks without slipping on frost-hardened ground. These contests were ephemeral, easily interrupted by orders, by the need to fetch firewood, by the sudden scream of a nearby animal. Yet in their fleeting presence, they offered a form of control over the physical self, a subtle assertion of skill, agility, and attention in a world otherwise dominated by chaos. Music, when available, became a secret pleasure. A harmonica, slightly out of tune, passed from hand to hand, filling the tent with warped melodies that reminded men of other times, other places, perhaps childhood memories, village gatherings, or distant celebrations, each note resonating with longing, nostalgia, and the faint glimmer of human connection. Singing was tentative, careful not to attract the wrong kind of notice, voices blending into whispers or hummed tunes, a quiet defiance against the monotony, a reminder that even amidst mud, snow, and metal, there existed a pulse of culture, of memory, of identity that refused to be extinguished. Storytelling became a subtle art, practiced quietly in corners, tents, or around weak fires. One man would begin a tale, exaggerated or true, punctuated with small gestures, eyes darting to ensure attention and maintain engagement. Listeners leaned in, ears straining over the murmur of wind and the occasional distant clatter, absorbing descriptions of distant cities, strange foods, bizarre encounters, or trivial misadventures. And in these narratives, laughter and astonishment mixed with a slow recognition of the absurdity of their current situation, offering a temporary escape from mud, cold, hunger, and the endless repetition of duty. Hunting small animals when the opportunity arose was another diversion. Even the meager pursuit of a rabbit, a bird, or a fish from a frozen stream offered both food and distraction. The concentration required demanding complete attention, sharpening senses dulled by monotony. The joy was subtle, the thrill not of conquest but of engagement, of participating fully in a task that could yield reward beyond the immediate calculation of survival. Sharing these small catches became another ritual, the division precise yet imbued with camaraderie, and in the act of passing portions, each man momentarily reclaimed a sense of fairness, agency, and participation in something beyond the rigid hierarchy of orders. Even small acts of mischief or minor rebellion existed in whispers and gestures, tricks played on fellow soldiers, rearranging objects, hiding tools temporarily, or quietly teasing those whose patience was short, all executed with care to avoid punishment. These acts of humor, subtle and often unnoticed by superiors, created a lattice of private knowledge, a sense of belonging, an acknowledgement that life, even at the edge of endurance, still contained moments of agency, creativity, and human connection. Reading, when possible, was treated with reverence. Pages of tattered books, letters, or smuggled newspapers became a portal to another world. The words absorbed slowly, deliberately, offering a mental escape and a reprieve from the physical demands of existence. The act of reading was itself a performance. Sitting with back straight, eyes scanning carefully, occasionally sharing passages allowed to spark discussion or reflection, drawing attention to ideas, stories, or observations that momentarily displaced thoughts of frostbite, hunger, or exhaustion. In the quietest hours of the evening, these diversions coalesced into a fragile sense of rhythm, a shared understanding that even amid hardship, moments of joy, amusement, and creativity could exist. Cards were packed away, dice smoothed into pockets, harmonicas returned to hidden pouches, stories concluded with soft exhalations. Yet the residue of laughter, competition, and memory lingered, a subtle thread binding men together, creating a shared language of survival that transcended orders, rations, and relentless cold. And in these small, almost imperceptible acts, the soldiers of the Eastern Front discovered fragments of life that were theirs alone. Private victories over monotony, tiny celebrations of human persistence, and quiet affirmations that even in the harshest circumstances, existence contained the possibility of fleeting joy. The body, so often taken for granted in everyday life, became an unending source of attention, complaint, and concern on the Eastern Front, where cold, exhaustion, malnutrition, and constant labor combined into a relentless assault. Skin chapped and cracked, fingers and toes swollen, muscles screaming from repetitive motion, and joints stiffened by frozen water and icy wind. Each man learned quickly that survival demanded vigilance not only against the enemy, but against the intimate, persistent attacks of his own body. Wounds, minor or severe, were commonplace. Cuts from shovels, splinters from broken crates, burns from careless fires, abrasions from crawling across frozen earth. Even these minor injuries carried risk, infection spreading silently, unnoticed at first, while fever rose and weakness crept through veins like water seeping under a frozen door. Field medics, under-resourced and often exhausted themselves, became both saviors and symbols of the harsh realities of survival. Improvised bandages, cobbled from strips of cloth, torn uniforms, or sheets of canvas, were applied with careful hands. Antiseptics improvised from whatever chemicals or alcohol could be found. The process executed swiftly, yet with precision, a balance between haste and effectiveness. Pain was tolerated silently, voices suppressed, grimaces hidden behind scarves, as even small complaints could mark a soldier as weak in the eyes of others, a liability to the group and the mission. Frostbite, that silent thief of flesh and sensation, arrived with little warning, creeping through gloves and boots, claiming toes, fingers, ears, and noses in a slow, cruel march. Soldiers learned the subtle signs, the tingling numbness, the waxy discoloration, and yet, even when recognized, remedies were limited. Rubbing, warmth, rotation of extremities, and hope, the hope that enough blood circulation and care could stave off permanent loss. The winter itself became a weapon, an enemy more patient and pervasive than any opposing soldier, and the struggle to maintain the integrity of one's body was relentless, constant, unforgiving. Illness compounded the problem, spreading through tents and barracks with astonishing ease. Dysentery, influenza, pneumonia, and other infections thrived in the cold, overcrowded, and poorly sanitized environments, taking advantage of weakened immunity, exhaustion, and inadequate nutrition. Men learned the grim mathematics of care. Who could be assisted, who needed isolation, who would survive the night, and who would succumb quietly while others slept fitfully, haunted by coughs, groans, and the low moans of those suffering nearby. Hygiene, simple in theory, became a monumental task, and water, when clean, was rationed carefully, prioritized for drinking over washing, leaving the soldiers perpetually grimy, lice-ridden, and uncomfortable, a condition normalized to the point that men barely noticed the persistent itch of infestation. Pain, whether from injury, illness, or fatigue, became a companion, a constant presence that shaped movement, speech, and thought. Simple tasks required calculation and strategy. Lifting, digging, marching, carrying supplies, and even holding utensils to eat. Routines were adapted around limitations, creating a landscape of micro-decisions, each small choice a battle against the gradual erosion of strength and stamina. Those who ignored the body's warnings often paid the price, collapsing unexpectedly, succumbing to fever, or leaving themselves vulnerable to accidents that would have been avoidable under normal conditions. Food, sparse and often nutritionally inadequate, exacerbated these physical challenges. Rations of black bread, thin soup, and occasionally preserved meat sustained life but not vitality. The body, starved of essential nutrients, became prone to infections, slower to heal, and more susceptible to exhaustion. Energy had to be rationed alongside food, and the mind, fatigued by constant attention to survival, often struggled to maintain focus, creating a cycle of strain that fed upon itself. Those with minor injuries or illness had to carefully decide whether to exert themselves in the necessary labor or risk falling behind, a choice complicated by the communal nature of work and the unspoken expectation of contribution. Even sleep, the refuge that offered recovery and temporary escape, was imperfect, broken by cold, discomfort, and anxiety. Wet clothing frozen solid, aching muscles, persistent coughs, and the knowledge that another day would demand repetition of these trials created restless nights, where dozing moments alternated with full awakenings, dreams intertwined with memory, and every small pain magnified in the dark, silent hours. Recovery was partial, fleeting, and fragile, requiring constant maintenance and vigilance, and men grew skilled in monitoring their bodies, learning to recognize subtle signs of worsening, adjusting clothing, activity, and effort to avoid irreversible harm. Through all this, camaraderie and observation became critical. Men watched each other for signs of weakness, offering help when possible, teasing gently to maintain morale, and sometimes silently calculating risks, ensuring that no weakness went unnoticed in a context where survival depended on vigilance, both personal and communal. In this landscape of physical struggle, the body became both battlefield and battleground, constantly tested, painfully aware, and demanding respect in a way that nothing else in the environment could replicate. The mind, like the body, endured assaults that were subtle, relentless, and uniquely exhausting, a theater in which fear, anticipation, and weariness played out in ways that left no man untouched. In the frozen expanse of the Eastern Front, moments of relative quiet were often more oppressive than moments of action, the silence heavy with the knowledge that danger could erupt without warning. Soldiers walked, ate, and slept under the constant shadow of the unknown, where every sound, distant artillery, the crack of ice underfoot, the sudden whistling of wind, triggered a visceral awareness of mortality. The mind, ever alert, processed endlessly, cataloging threats, imagining contingencies, and replaying mistakes with merciless precision, a cycle that eroded calm and fostered a strange coexistence of hypervigilance and exhaustion. Conversations among men, when they occurred, were often thinly veiled attempts to mask fear, to maintain the semblance of control in a situation where control was largely an illusion. Humor, dark and biting, served as a fragile salve, a temporary distraction from the constant mental tension. Stories of past skirmishes, exaggerations of danger faced and survived, and whispered tales of horrors witnessed elsewhere became communal rituals, bonding mechanisms that allowed men to externalize anxiety, even as it burrowed deeper into their psyches. Sleep, when it came, was fragmented, invaded by dreams that blended memory, hope, and dread, the mind incapable of total rest while danger remained a tangible possibility at every hour. The waiting was perhaps the cruelest element of all. Waiting for orders, for patrols to return, for the next wave of enemy fire, for the mail that might never come, for the hunger to be satisfied, or for the cold to ease. Time itself seemed distorted, the minutes stretching endlessly under the oppressive weight of monotony, punctuated by bursts of adrenaline that offered no lasting relief. Each soldier developed personal rituals, small attempts to exert control over perception. Counting steps, examining equipment, silently rehearsing procedures, or performing repetitive motions with hands and arms, each act a tether to sanity amidst the vast, indifferent chaos. Isolation, even in groups, magnified psychological strain. Men recognized that proximity did not equal understanding, that those beside them could neither fully feel nor articulate their internal experiences. Letters from home, when they arrived, were both balm and torment, evoking longing, guilt, and frustration. The mind became a landscape of contradictions, longing for comfort, yet conditioned to distrust it, craving calm, yet wired to anticipate chaos, seeking connection, yet bracing for loss. Emotional regulation became a survival skill as critical as handling weapons, as essential as maintaining warmth or nutrition, a delicate balancing act in which any lapse could spiral into panic, despair, or paralysis. Fear, ever-present, wore many masks. It was anticipation, acute and electric, a tightening of the chest before a patrol, a subtle tremor in the hands before handling munitions, a silent counting of heartbeats in the dark. It was retrospection, a gnawing anxiety about decisions made or avoided, about risks taken or ignored, about the actions of yesterday that might haunt today. It was cumulative, layering upon exhaustion, malnutrition, and physical pain, producing cognitive fog, irritability, and occasional episodes of numbing, where the mind, seeking refuge, dissociated in fleeting moments from reality, retreating into imagined spaces where danger was muted and pain could be momentarily ignored. Routine in this mental landscape offered the illusion of control. Tasks as simple as distributing rations, maintaining clothing and equipment, or organizing sleeping arrangements provided a framework against which anxiety could be measured and managed. Every task, no matter how menial, was performed with a heightened awareness of consequence, each small act of diligence a bulwark against the creeping chaos within. Even mundane conversations, small gestures of camaraderie, shared jokes or complaints, were vital anchors, points of reference that tethered the mind to a fragile equilibrium amidst the turbulence of uncertainty. Adaptation became a cognitive survival strategy. Men learned to accept fear as a companion rather than an enemy, to integrate it into decision-making without allowing it to dominate, to cultivate patience as a defensive skill, and to recognize the futility of control over the uncontrollable. Observation sharpened into a finely tuned radar, noticing shifts in wind, the tone of a comrade's voice, patterns in enemy movement, and subtle physiological cues in one's own body that signaled stress or fatigue. In this constant mental vigilance, a soldier's mind could oscillate between clarity and confusion, between strategic foresight and paralyzing doubt. The line between rational anticipation and irrational anxiety blurred by exhaustion, hunger, and isolation. Even laughter, when it occurred, carried undertones of tension, a temporary release of energy rather than true joy. Moments of levity were brief reprieves, quickly replaced by renewed awareness of danger and scarcity. The mind's capacity for hope and imagination persisted, but it was carefully rationed, deployed with precision and often immediately counterbalanced by rational preparation for adversity. Emotional equilibrium, like physical resilience, became a daily achievement, precarious and provisional, subject to rapid erosion by the smallest misfortune or unexpected development. The psychological terrain of the Eastern Front was therefore as treacherous as the physical landscape, invisible, pervasive, and unyielding. Survival required constant negotiation with one's own mind, the cultivation of skills as subtle as they were critical, and the relentless maintenance of a fragile internal stability that could easily be shattered by exhaustion, injury, or the sudden intrusion of terror. Those who endured learned not merely to act under fire but to live under continuous psychological siege, an unrelenting trial that challenged identity, resilience, and the very perception of reality itself. Even amidst the relentless cold, the ever-present threat of death, and the gnawing hunger that haunted every waking hour, soldiers found ways to carve small islands of respite, moments that allowed the mind and body to breathe, however briefly, from the oppressive rhythm of survival. These moments were neither grand nor heroic. They were quiet, often absurd attempts to preserve humanity, rituals that connected men to life beyond the frozen wasteland of mud, blood, and snow. Cards, dice, and makeshift board games became vital conduits of escape, played under the dim flicker of lanterns in dugouts or improvised shelters, the shuffling of worn cards and the clatter of dice against wooden surfaces creating a fragile soundtrack of normalcy against the backdrop of artillery fire. Stories, both true and exaggerated, were told and retold, each man vying for the attention of his peers, embellishing encounters with the enemy or escapes from danger. Humor was sharpened by desperation and by the necessity of distraction. Jokes were dark, ironic, sometimes cruel, yet each one served a purpose: to remind men that they were still alive, still capable of feeling amusement even when surrounded by death. Singing, when permitted, rose in low, muffled tones. Old folk songs, wartime ballads, snippets of childhood melodies, each note a tether to memory, a fragile thread connecting the present suffering to a past less encumbered by fear. Meals, though monotonous and often insufficient, were sometimes transformed into minor rituals, occasions for camaraderie and improvisation. Canned goods, hard biscuits, and meager portions of meat were shared, divided, and occasionally seasoned with imagination, the scarcity itself turning each morsel into an event of small celebration. A piece of chocolate, a sip of coffee, or a rare portion of fresh bread became treasures, moments that briefly replaced anxiety with contentment, an ephemeral taste of the world left behind. Men improvised as well, crafting makeshift musical instruments from scraps, carving small figurines from wood or metal, or drawing crude sketches on any surface available, their efforts silent affirmations that creativity and life persisted even in the most inhospitable conditions. Letter writing, when possible, occupied long hours, a meditative practice that could bring both joy and sorrow. Men poured words onto paper, recounting daily routines, expressing longing, or fabricating mundane stories to reassure loved ones that survival continued. The act of writing itself was an assertion of self, a temporary dominion over a reality otherwise dictated by violence, frost, and exhaustion. Reading, too, became a refuge. Books, letters, or even scraps of newspapers provided brief mental excursions, journeys into worlds beyond the trenches, into stories and knowledge that reminded men of perspectives other than survival. Physical contests, too, emerged spontaneously, fueled by boredom, restlessness, or the need to assert vitality in a space otherwise dominated by decay and stagnation. Foot races through snow, impromptu wrestling matches, or tests of strength with whatever tools or materials were available allowed bursts of energy, laughter, and risk-free competition that contrasted sharply with the lethal stakes of the surrounding environment. The exertion, while minor, also reminded soldiers that they still possessed agency, a body capable of action, a self beyond the uniform and the rifle. Religious rituals and superstitions played their roles as well, providing comfort and structure in a world where chaos reigned. Prayers whispered before dawn, the marking of small talismans or symbols on personal belongings, the quiet adherence to personal routines imbued with ritual significance. These practices created pockets of psychological stability, helping men navigate the unpredictability of daily existence. Each ritual, no matter how simple or eccentric, acted as a thread of continuity, connecting the present moment to a broader, ordered vision of the world that resisted the disorder surrounding it. The capacity for conversation, for shared reflection, was a lifeline. Men discussed memories of home, imagined futures beyond the conflict, debated trivial topics with fervor, or simply listened as others spoke, the presence of another human being offering reassurance that they were not alone in suffering. The act of listening, of being heard, became a subtle but critical form of sustenance, nourishing the mind in ways that food alone could not. In these exchanges, camaraderie became a shield against despair, small acts of mutual acknowledgement, a reinforcement of identity amidst the dehumanizing forces of war. Even the cold itself could be a source of dark amusement, a cruelly ironic reminder of survival. Soldiers competed to see who could endure the icy wind the longest without complaint, who could fashion the most creative snow fortifications, who could manage to maintain some semblance of routine despite frostbite and numbness. Laughter in these moments was tinged with irony, the absurdity of human persistence under extreme adversity underscored by the very immediacy of the threat that made play possible. These ephemeral moments, scattered and fleeting, were crucial not merely for morale but for psychological endurance. In a landscape where hope was scarce and suffering abundant, the human mind clung to distraction, levity, and ritual as lifelines. Cards, songs, letters, sketches, small competitions, prayers, and conversations were more than mere diversions. They were the mechanisms by which sanity was preserved, the subtle assertion that life, creativity, and agency persisted even when the world seemed bent on erasing them. The act of eating on the Eastern Front was never a mundane routine. It was a performance, a calculated negotiation between scarcity, improvisation, and the ever-present gnawing of hunger that seemed to have its own consciousness, stalking every soldier with relentless persistence. Meals were dictated by what could be carried, found, or requisitioned, and every bite was simultaneously a blessing and a reminder of fragility. Canned meat, though often tough and tasteless, was valued as gold. Its rust-stained container a promise of temporary relief from emptiness. Hard biscuits, sometimes crumbling into powder with each bite, were rationed with religious precision, counted and divided like currency, each fragment savored with the meticulous care of a jeweler inspecting a gem. The act of eating on the Eastern Front was never a mundane routine. It was a performance, a calculated negotiation between scarcity, improvisation, and the ever-present gnawing of hunger that seemed to have its own consciousness, stalking every soldier with relentless persistence. Meals were dictated by what could be carried, found, or requisitioned, and every bite was simultaneously a blessing and a reminder of fragility. Canned meat, though often tough and tasteless, was valued as gold. Its rust-stained container a promise of temporary relief from emptiness. Hard biscuits, sometimes crumbling into powder with each bite, were rationed with religious precision, counted and divided like currency, each fragment savored with the meticulous care of a jeweler inspecting a gem. Soup was a common solace, though it was often little more than boiled water with scraps of root vegetables or dried grains, a thin, watery concoction that barely filled the stomach but offered warmth, which in itself was a subtle form of nourishment. Soldiers became inventors in these kitchens of necessity, mixing ingredients that might have seemed incompatible in other circumstances, creating combinations that could coax flavor or at least mask monotony. Salt, when available, was treasured beyond measure, its ability to transform the bland into something bearable a reminder that even the smallest privileges could carry enormous psychological weight. Occasionally, foraging provided unexpected variety. Soldiers would venture into forests or abandoned villages, gathering what could be scavenged. Roots, berries, even the occasional stray poultry or livestock left behind by fleeing civilians. Such expeditions carried risk, as the front lines were never far, but the rewards could make the peril seem worthwhile, a temporary reprieve from rations that were otherwise unrelentingly meager. Cooking over small, improvised fires, sometimes in the open while watching the distant glow of artillery, became an exercise in patience, ingenuity, and caution, with smoke carefully concealed and flames carefully nurtured. Coffee was a ritual and a luxury, a bitter liquid that offered warmth and a semblance of normalcy. It was shared in small quantities, often with more emphasis on the ceremony than the taste itself. Soldiers would gather around a flickering flame, watching the dark liquid drip into tin cups, the aroma cutting through the metallic scent of gunpowder and frost. Even the smallest sip was celebrated, a temporary reclaiming of the senses from the cold and monotony. Sugar, when it existed, was rationed like a precious gem, sprinkled sparingly into coffee or absorbed directly from small paper packets that seemed to offer an almost mystical comfort. Meat, when available, was often tough, dried, or salted, yet it carried the satisfaction of substance in a way that nothing else could. Soldiers became adept at preparing it over minimal heat, slicing thin portions to stretch its utility, boiling or roasting scraps to maximize flavor while minimizing consumption. Occasionally, tinned fish appeared, sardines, herring, sometimes mackerel, whose oily tang filled the air and left lingering traces on fingers that would later be rubbed against coats and gloves, a tactile memory of sustenance. Bread was scarce, often stale or frozen solid, yet it was chewed slowly, the texture and taste magnified by deprivation, the very act of mastication becoming a small ritual of survival. Water, though theoretically abundant, was frequently dangerous or unpalatable, drawn from streams or puddles contaminated with mud, leaves, or the runoff of trenches. Soldiers learned to boil, filter, or improvise purification, understanding that hydration was inseparable from survival, even if the liquid itself was a cold, bland companion to the scant food it accompanied. Snow was melted when nothing else could be found, a practice that carried both risk and necessity, the effort of transformation itself reinforcing the tenuous control men had over their existence. Hunger was not merely a physical sensation. It was a constant companion, a shadow that shaped every decision and interaction. It sharpened the mind to resourcefulness, forced cooperation among soldiers in the sharing of provisions, and occasionally provoked desperation when rations dwindled. Stories were told of men eating things that under ordinary circumstances would have been unthinkable. Roots, bark, or scraps of unrecognizable origin, the instinct to survive overpowering both revulsion and fatigue. In these moments, even the most disciplined or proud could become inventors, alchemists transforming the meager into the edible, stretching sustenance across hours, days, and the uncertain promise of tomorrow. Yet even with all this creativity, meals were rarely satisfying. They were functional, meant to maintain the fragile equilibrium between energy and exhaustion, hunger and hallucination, despair and the faint glimmer of hope that another dawn would arrive. Each bite carried weight, a measure not just of calories but of courage, endurance, and the capacity to persist against circumstances that seemed designed to break body and spirit alike. Eating became a ritual of defiance, a daily assertion that despite the overwhelming forces of nature, war, and deprivation, life, however tenuous, continued. Sleep on the Eastern Front was a fleeting, often illusory luxury, a fragile interlude carved out amid the cacophony of gunfire, artillery, and the ceaseless hum of a winter that seemed intent on testing human endurance to its absolute limits. Trenches offered some protection, but the mud, frozen earth, and relentless damp made true rest nearly impossible. Bodies shivered in unison with the wind, teeth chattering and muscles tensed against the cold that seeped into bones with a persistence that mocked even the thickest coats. Men learned to curl into themselves, huddling together for warmth, sharing body heat in a silent, wordless testament to necessity over pride, understanding that proximity was survival, not comfort. Bedding was often non-existent, scraps of canvas, straw, or blankets scrounged from abandoned homes and battlefields serving as crude insulation. The slightest shift could bring dampness from the earth into contact with the skin, and a night's sleep could leave soldiers feeling as if they had traversed miles in a snowstorm rather than simply lying down for a few hours. Sleep cycles were irregular, stolen in segments, sometimes as brief as a few minutes while a comrade kept watch or a distant explosion momentarily paused. These fragmented rests accumulated into a weight that pressed on the mind as much as the body, creating hallucinations, irritability, and an acute awareness of the ever-present danger. Fatigue was more than muscle soreness or exhaustion. It was a gnawing emptiness that infiltrated every thought, a fog that dulled perception yet heightened the senses in other, paradoxical ways. Soldiers reported dreams tinged with reality, where trenches stretched endlessly and frostbitten fingers could no longer respond to commands, where distant cries merged with the groan of artillery into a symphony of unease. The mind became a battlefield itself, as much as the land around them, demanding vigilance even as every nerve, every sinew, begged for release. Illness thrived in this environment. Frostbite was a constant threat, creeping silently into extremities, a slow betrayal of the body's own defenses. Feet, fingers, noses, and ears became pale, numb, and finally blackened if ignored, each injury a potential path to infection or permanent disability. Dysentery spread easily, exacerbated by contaminated water and minimal sanitation, leaving soldiers weak, feverish, and desperate for relief that might not come until the next ration or the next opportunity for basic hygiene. Lice and other vermin were relentless companions, their bites a constant irritation, their presence a reminder that even in the midst of human conflict, other forms of life thrived at the expense of the weary and unprotected. Clothing and footwear, meant to provide protection, were often inadequate against the brutal extremes of winter and mud, threadbare in some areas, layered haphazardly in others. Soldiers improvised, wrapping cloths around exposed skin, stuffing straw into boots, or sharing outerwear with comrades, creating a patchwork armor of warmth that was fragile and temporary. Each morning was a negotiation with the elements, the simple act of dressing becoming a careful choreography designed to preserve body heat while maintaining mobility and readiness. The elements themselves were adversaries that demanded both respect and ingenuity. Snowstorms could erase paths, bury equipment, and disorient even the most seasoned units. Frost could crack bones when movement slowed. Wind, cutting and constant, carried with it both icy bite and the invisible weight of fatigue. Rain, mixed with melting snow, transformed the terrain into a quagmire, swallowing boots, wagons, and morale alike. In these conditions, survival depended not only on strength but on constant observation, adaptation, and a willingness to embrace discomfort as a permanent companion rather than a temporary inconvenience. Rest, when it came, was accompanied by rituals as much psychological as practical. Soldiers would exchange stories in hushed tones, recounting memories from homes far away, or whispering thoughts of food, women, or moments of peace that seemed absurdly luxurious in contrast to the mud, blood, and frost around them. Some wrote letters by candlelight or the faint glow of a distant fire, ink smudged by trembling hands, hoping that these fragments of human connection might serve as both a lifeline and a salve for the mind. Even laughter, rare and fleeting, carried the weight of resilience, a rebellion against the omnipresent shadow of fatigue and illness. In the absence of true sleep, soldiers developed routines that mimicked it. Short periods of rest while standing, leaning against walls or trees, or dozing in shifts where one man watched while another succumbed to microsleep, trusting instinct and trust in comrades to shield them from danger. Every action, every minute, was infused with awareness, the body and mind locked in an ongoing negotiation with exhaustion, illness, and exposure, a triad of pressures that tested the limits of human endurance in ways that rarely find comparison outside this frozen, mud-soaked theater of war. Even amid the relentless grind of the Eastern Front, soldiers sought fragments of normalcy, grasping at moments that reminded them they were still human beyond the uniform, the rifle, and the mud-streaked trenches. Letters from home were treasured above almost all else, the paper often worn and smudged, ink bleeding slightly from damp hands, yet carrying the voices of mothers, fathers, wives, fiancés, and siblings. Reading these letters became a ritual. The crinkle of the envelope, the smell of familiar paper, the faint pressure of a handwritten word, all created an oasis of emotional warmth against the constant chill of frost and fear. Men would read and reread the same lines, committing phrases to memory, whispering the words to themselves when sleep refused to come, as if by speaking aloud they could hold onto a fragment of life outside the battlefield. Entertainment took strange, improvisational forms. A deck of cards, tattered and dog-eared, could occupy hours, providing both distraction and quiet competition, a way to measure skill, luck, and strategy without bullets or artillery. Dice games, simple board sketches drawn in the dirt, or the creation of impromptu stories shared in low voices under the canopy of frost-laden branches became a collective defiance against boredom and despair. Humor, dark and ironic, thrived in whispered jokes, subtle pranks, and sarcastic commentary on the endless tedium and absurdity of daily survival, binding men together and reminding them that they still possessed wit and agency, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Food, though often meager, played a central role in these small pleasures. Cans of preserved meat, hard biscuits, or the occasional ration of chocolate were moments of celebration, a rare sweetness in a monotonous diet. Soldiers would trade items, concoct improvised stews over tiny fires, or attempt to create delicacies from foraged roots and frozen vegetables, turning necessity into fleeting culinary invention. The preparation itself, stirring a pot over a smoky flame in the quiet of a trench, was meditative, a rhythm that counterbalanced the chaotic pulse of warfare outside their fragile shelters. Some found solace in music, a harmonica, a makeshift drum, or the collective hum of a favorite tune could transform a frostbitten night into something less oppressive, even if only for minutes. Soldiers would hum quietly together, their voices melding with the wind or the distant rumble of artillery, creating a fragile bridge to humanity in an environment designed to strip it away. In these moments, camaraderie deepened, not just as a tactical necessity, but as an emotional lifeline, a reminder that survival depended as much on social bonds as on weaponry or ration discipline. Stories were currency as well. Men recounted memories from before the war, tales of hometowns and rivers, of festivals and meals, of loved ones and routine chores that seemed impossibly distant yet tangible in the warmth of shared recollection. These narratives were not mere escapism. They were affirmations of identity, anchors that preserved the self against the disorienting abstraction of war. Listeners could close their eyes and, for a short time, walk beside a remembered friend through a remembered field, tasting imagined food, feeling imagined sun on the back of their necks, and briefly forgetting the biting cold that clawed at their cheeks. Even trivial competitions provided structure and engagement. Foot races along muddy paths, snowball fights in fleeting lulls, or the meticulous crafting of paper figures and tiny trinkets became subtle declarations of agency. These activities required minimal equipment but demanded attention, dexterity, and creativity, and their absurdity in such a deadly context made them all the more cherished. Victory in these games was sweet precisely because it was inconsequential, a contrast to the omnipresent stakes of life and death, offering a psychological reprieve that nourished resilience. Religion and reflection also played quiet roles in passing the time. Soldiers whispered prayers, made the sign of a cross in the mud, or silently acknowledged a deity while staring at the infinite stretch of sky above trenches and forests. Superstitions arose, strange rituals intended to ward off misfortune, conserve luck, or appease unseen forces that seemed to control the trajectory of a day or the outcome of a skirmish. These beliefs were neither uniform nor institutionalized, yet they provided comfort, offering a sense of predictability in an existence otherwise ruled by chaos and chance. Even boredom itself became a shared experience, a landscape upon which men could project stories, challenges, and camaraderie. The long stretches of waiting, of staring into snow-covered trees or a gray, frozen horizon, were themselves a crucible for imagination. Men whispered rumors, invented ghost stories, or debated mundane topics in exhaustive detail, transforming the monotony into a canvas for human ingenuity, connection, and endurance. In every letter read, every card game played, every improvised stew stirred over a faint fire, soldiers carved slivers of humanity from the relentless, grinding machinery of war. These were not merely distractions. They were survival tools, subtle yet vital, preserving sanity and identity when circumstances demanded near-total suppression of self. The Eastern Front, with its mud, snow, bullets, and frost, tested bodies, minds, and souls. Yet even here, amid devastation and danger, men clung to ritual, laughter, memory, and fleeting pleasure, finding in them the quiet affirmation that existence, however fragile, persisted. The first light of dawn often brought a deceptive calm, the landscape painted in muted shades of gray and white, frost glinting off barbed wire and abandoned equipment. Yet beneath that fragile serenity lurked anticipation, tension, and the omnipresent threat of violence. Orders arrived with brisk efficiency, carried by runners or shouted across frozen fields, each directive demanding obedience without hesitation, and each carrying the invisible weight of responsibility for lives in the balance. Soldiers moved with practiced precision, their every action measured against the possibility of immediate consequence, the rhythm of preparation as exacting as the mechanical pulse of artillery, the grinding of tank treads, and the distant, irregular staccato of machine gun fire. Fear was a constant companion, subtle and pervasive, fluctuating like the wind through leafless trees. It took many forms. The sharp, visceral shock of an incoming shell, the creeping dread of isolation in a trench, the silent panic of a flanking maneuver by an unseen enemy, or the gnawing anxiety of a missed order that could imperil comrades. Soldiers learned to coexist with fear, transforming it into vigilance, instinct, and sometimes the numb acceptance that survival was partially a matter of chance. That acceptance did not diminish courage but reframed it, shaping behavior in a world where hesitation could be fatal and overconfidence even deadlier. Tactics were both art and necessity, a delicate interplay of terrain, resources, and timing. Patrols scouted frozen forests and open fields, analyzing enemy positions, listening for movement beneath snow-covered ground, and noting the faint smoke from distant fires. Camouflage, improvised from branches, snow, and discarded materials, became vital, and men developed an intimate understanding of observation, shadows, and silhouette, each movement calculated to avoid detection, each pause pregnant with potential danger. Small decisions, the angle of a rifle sight, The choice of a path around a ridge, the manner in which one descended a slope, carried consequences that could ripple through the lives of dozens of comrades. Commanders, both distant and immediate, exerted influence with rigid expectations. Orders often seemed impossible or contradictory, yet obedience was imperative, a social and military contract binding each individual to the larger operation. Interaction with officers was fraught with subtle tension. Speaking too much could be perceived as insubordination, too little as incompetence, yet understanding, anticipating, and interpreting intent could mean the difference between maneuvering successfully or being trapped in exposed positions. The invisible calculus of trust, competence, and initiative shaped daily experience as acutely as bullets and frostbite. Engagements were sudden and disorienting, erupting with sensory overload. The crack of rifles, the roar of mortars, the whistle of shells cutting through the frosty air, and the intermittent, terrifying silence that followed, when all that remained was the smell of smoke, cordite, and the damp, iron-tinged scent of the frozen earth. Men reacted instinctively, yet strategy dictated patterns. Suppressive fire, flanking, retreat, advance. Each movement a dance on the edge of chaos. Coordination with comrades was essential. A single misstep or miscommunication could cascade into catastrophe. Every encounter carried the potential for swift, violent change, an acute reminder that planning was never absolute, and adaptability often more vital than courage alone. Sleep was scarce and fragmented, stolen in fleeting intervals while maintaining readiness for alarm, while listening to distant artillery or the irregular sounds of approaching enemy movement. Fatigue amplified fear, sharpened irritability, and dulled reflexes. Yet soldiers persisted, often subconsciously relying on the habits, rituals, and structures they had honed over weeks and months. Meals, when they occurred, were quick and functional, calories more critical than taste, and warmth more of a tactical concern than a comfort. Even in the midst of scarcity and exhaustion, camaraderie persisted, a quiet web of mutual vigilance, reassurance, and silent support that underscored the human dimension of warfare. Psychological strain accumulated invisibly, a slow erosion amplified by constant exposure to death, injury, and the unpredictable cruelty of winter campaigns. Men developed subtle coping mechanisms, silent observation of distant wildlife, counting steps across familiar terrain, sketching crude maps, murmuring fragments of remembered songs, or rehearsing conversations with loved ones. These acts, seemingly trivial, preserved mental integrity, offering brief anchoring points in a world otherwise defined by external chaos and internal tension. Even small victories carried disproportionate significance. Surviving an ambush, capturing a minor supply depot, or executing a flanking maneuver without casualties became ephemeral triumphs, celebrated quietly, marked by nods, grins, or whispered words of encouragement. Conversely, failure left lingering shadows, manifesting as second-guessing, tension, or muttered curses beneath frostbitten breath, reinforcing the unrelenting demands of the front. Each day, each order, each encounter was a meticulous negotiation with fear, skill, circumstance, and the fragile web of human trust that bound soldiers together in perilous continuity. The winter on the Eastern Front arrived not gradually but as an unforgiving wave, sweeping across forests, plains, and river valleys with a suddenness that left preparation always incomplete and plans perpetually vulnerable. Temperatures fell below comprehension, each breath crystallizing in the air and forming a mist that clung to beards, eyelashes, and the collars of tattered coats, while frost coated the ground so firmly that footsteps crunched like brittle glass beneath boots. Snow blanketed the landscape with deceptive calm, softening sound yet concealing treacherous ice, hidden ditches, and the remains of abandoned equipment. Each step a potential trap, each pause an invitation for frostbite or misjudgment. Soldiers discovered, often too late, that even minor exposure could produce numbness, slow reflexes, and fatigue that turned mundane tasks into dangerous struggles. Clothing became simultaneously a lifeline and a burden, layers of wool, felt, and whatever improvised rags could be scavenged, each intended to preserve warmth yet restricting movement, creating friction against the skin and accumulating moisture from sweat or melting snow. When wet, fabric became an insidious enemy, cooling rapidly, chilling flesh in a way that ordinary fear could not mitigate, while gloves and boots, though thick, failed to prevent the slow, creeping loss of dexterity that could render a rifle useless or a shovel dangerously unwieldy. Soldiers learned to manage heat in incremental, tactical ways, removing layers during exertion, keeping extremities in motion, and relying on mutual observation to prevent comrades from succumbing to the silent, insidious advance of hypothermia. Meals, already meager, became even more critical and difficult to consume. Canned meats, hard biscuits, and tinned preserves froze in unheated quarters, requiring open fires to thaw just enough to render them edible. Yet fire brought visibility and risk, smoke drawing the eyes of nearby enemy patrols. Boiling water became an operation in itself. Melting snow, maintaining flame, and rationing fuel, each step consuming precious energy, while the taste of lukewarm tea or partially defrosted porridge offered temporary comfort but little nutrition. The scarcity of fresh food intensified fatigue, slowed reaction times, and eroded morale, making every morsel both sustenance and an incentive to maintain alertness. And yet even with caloric intake, the body constantly expended more energy than it could store, leaving soldiers in a persistent state of mild starvation compounded by frostbite, exhaustion, and exertion. Sleeping arrangements were improvised and uncomfortable, often trenches lined with frozen earth, snow-packed bunkers, or barns and abandoned houses stripped of furnishings. Blankets, when present, were thin and often shared, damp from condensation or melted snow, while the cold penetrated even walls, floors, and makeshift insulation. The struggle for warmth became communal, soldiers huddling together to conserve heat, the shared body warmth a fragile bulwark against the relentless freeze, yet never completely sufficient, leaving most nights punctuated by restless movement, teeth chattering, and the ever-present hum of fear and anticipation. Daily routines adapted to these extremes, with tasks extended by the cold's interference. Shoveling snow, clearing ice from pathways, maintaining machinery that stiffened and seized under frost, and standing guard while boots sank into crusted drifts or toes turned numb and unresponsive. Each act, mundane in warmer climates, became an intricate choreography of survival, requiring calculation, endurance, and relentless attention to the smallest details. Even the simplest gestures, removing a mitten to reload a rifle, lighting a match to inspect supplies, or adjusting a hat that impeded vision, carried risk, each exposing skin to sub-zero temperatures that could result in frostbite in minutes. Transportation of supplies became a challenge of immense consequence. Horses, sleds, and trucks struggled through snowdrifts and frozen mud, engines failing under the weight of ice, and wheels sinking into unexpected soft patches hidden beneath snow cover. Soldiers assisted in hauling supplies, pulling sledges through treacherous terrain, while the cold sapped strength and amplified exhaustion, the rhythmic strain of repeated effort turning bodies into aching, rigid machines barely able to respond to the demands of immediate survival or tactical necessity. Communication lines froze, equipment malfunctioned, and movement slowed, creating gaps that could be exploited by an opportunistic enemy, and forcing constant improvisation to sustain the operational integrity of units in the field. Morale ebbed and flowed with subtle indicators. The warmth of a brief fire, the sound of a distant bird signaling change in weather, the brief thawing of rations, or the camaraderie of shared struggle. Stories circulated quietly, murmured to maintain connection, relayed with humor or irony to soften the harshness of reality, yet always under the shadow of imminent danger and discomfort. Soldiers became adept at reading the emotional temperature of the group, understanding that slight gestures of encouragement or shared frustration could prevent despair from crystallizing into paralyzing hopelessness. And yet the omnipresent cold remained an unyielding, merciless force, indifferent to strategy, courage, or human will. Even leisure, rare and fleeting, adapted to winter's constraints. Games of chance or skill were improvised in corners of barns, empty rooms, or temporary shelters, often involving scraps of paper, cards, or small objects, each distraction temporary, yet vital for mental resilience. Conversation, when voices were not muffled by scarves and frost, turned to memories of distant home, speculation about future campaigns, and the minutiae of existence far from the front lines. Each story a tether to normalcy and humanity in a world dominated by cold, hunger, and uncertainty. As the guns finally fell silent and the relentless rhythm of marching, shooting, and survival ceased to dominate every waking hour, a strange and fragile stillness settled over the land, a quiet that carried with it both relief and an oppressive weight, a sense of emptiness left behind by the departure of constant threat, yet also a haunting echo of the violence, cold, and deprivation that had shaped every thought and movement for so long. Soldiers, those who remained, walked through landscapes forever altered, villages reduced to skeletal frames of timber, snow-dusted ruins, and scorched earth, where the ghosts of lives once lived whispered faintly on the wind, their absence tangible in every collapsed roof, frozen river, and charred fence post. Camps, once alive with the murmur of shared tasks and the harsh cadence of orders, were now silent, with only the occasional groan of wood settling, the whisper of frost across empty trenches, or the flutter of birds uncertainly returning to land that had known nothing but fear. The routines that had once defined existence, the struggle to light a fire, the careful rationing of food, the endless adjustments to clothing against the penetrating cold, had vanished, leaving soldiers to confront the vast, echoing quiet, and to reckon with the ways in which the war had reshaped not only the land but their minds, their bodies, and the very perception of time. Memories of food, once scarcest of comforts, returned in vivid detail. The brittle crunch of frozen biscuits, the bitter warmth of minimally thawed stew, the occasional taste of chocolate or jam, smuggled and cherished moments of small indulgence amid the daily struggle. Every bite remembered not merely for sustenance but as an intimate marker of survival, as if each meal had been a testament to endurance, a defiance against frost, hunger, and exhaustion. Hands, once numb and awkward in gloves, now traced the shapes of familiar utensils and tools, remembering gestures made countless times under duress, muscles recalling the strain of hauling sledges, shoveling snow, and operating machinery in temperatures that numbed both body and spirit. Sleep, when it came, was both recovery and reflection, lying beneath blankets, perhaps in a restored building or in a still frozen trench, listening to the distant wind whisper across abandoned landscapes, feeling the subtle return of warmth to toes and fingertips, and realizing that even rest was now layered with memories of nights when dreams had been punctuated by fear, frost, and distant explosions. The body, long disciplined by the demands of survival, surrendered to quiet rhythms, yet the mind remained alert to the textures of memory. The smell of wood smoke, the taste of half-frozen tea, the echo of commands shouted across icy fields, and the murmur of voices from comrades, some lost, some present, all indelibly etched into consciousness. Encounters with the local populace, brief and fragile, replayed with vivid clarity. The cautious exchange of information, the sharing of meager rations, the silent acknowledgement of shared suffering, the resilience of civilians who had endured occupation, displacement, and the collapse of familiar life, whose eyes reflected both fear and defiance, whose homes had been reduced to ash and snow, yet whose existence continued in small acts of persistence, tending livestock, collecting firewood, and maintaining routines that had seemed impossible amidst chaos. Soldiers, too, carried their own sense of displacement, realizing that survival had been both a triumph and a burden, leaving them unmoored, unable to fully return to the ordinary rhythms of life, yet in possession of memories that demanded both reflection and quiet acknowledgement. Leisure, once improvised amid danger, now took a different shape, quieter, slower, marked by reflection and the small gestures that signified human continuity. Sharing stories of home, writing letters never sent, carving simple marks into wood or snow, observing the slow passage of sunlight across frozen landscapes, listening to the distant river, or the crackle of residual fires. Even humor, a fragile tool of endurance during wartime, returned in subtle forms, wry smiles, whispered recollections, ironic commentary on the absurdity of survival, yet tempered by the profound fatigue and the quiet gravity of experience, a gentle acknowledgement that life, despite its continuity, had been fundamentally reshaped. And as the days lengthened and snow began to soften, revealing the contours of land that had lain hidden, A slow acceptance settled over those who remained. Acceptance of loss, of endurance, of the indelible imprint of the Eastern Front on body, mind, and spirit. Time, once measured by orders, marches, rations, and gunfire, began to stretch differently, slower, allowing for contemplation, for the recognition of what had been survived and what had been irrevocably changed. Every landscape, every ruined village, every frozen tree became a quiet testament, a reminder of the magnitude of human endurance, of the relentless winter, of the decisions, mistakes, and acts of resilience that had defined existence on this front, leaving behind a memory both haunting and deeply human. And so, in the quiet aftermath, soldiers, civilians, and the land itself entered a rhythm less dictated by fear and necessity, moving through a world still scarred but surviving, carrying forward stories of hunger, cold, exhaustion, fleeting warmth, rare laughter, and relentless perseverance, until those who had endured could finally rest, if only partially, in the knowledge that survival itself, however costly, was a testament to the human capacity to endure even the most unforgiving conditions.